Welcome back to Eject Media. The 1970s were a wild, unsettling era for horror. While classics like The Exorcist and Halloween get all the attention, there's a hidden world of chilling, overlooked films that push boundaries in gore, atmosphere, and pure madness. Tonight, we're diving into the overlooked titles of the 1970s, 100 movies that deserve a second look, and maybe a few sleepless nights. Hollywood Horror House, 1970. Hollywood Horror House, released under its original title Savage Intruder, is what happens when the glamour of old Hollywood finally collapses under its own ghosts. Arriving in 1970, it plays like Sunset Boulevard spiked with LSD, a lurid, unsettling vision of fame, decay, and madness wrapped in the glitzy corpse of a Gothic thriller. Miriam Hopkins stars as Catherine Packard, a once revered screen queen now locked inside her crumbling mansion, numbed by drink and trapped in memories of her youth. When a young man named Vic appears, offering help and attention, her loneliness curdles into danger, and his intentions turn out to be anything but pure. Director Donald Wolfe films the mansion as both palace and prison, a decaying shrine to a vanished era. The colors are oversaturated and hallucinatory. Sickly greens, crimson reds, golden light turning toxic by the frame. Hopkins gives the role a tragic dignity, half performance, half confession, while John David Garfield plays Vic with a deranged charm that only deepens the film's sense of rot. It's equal parts exploitation and art horror, with moments that feel improvised, deranged, and hypnotic. By its final act, Hollywood Horror House has stripped away any pretense of glamour. It's a nightmare about what happens when the lights go out and the past refuses to die. In 1970, Gothic horror wasn't fading quietly. It was being reborn in the ruins of the American dream. Cry of the Banshee, 1970. Few films embody the tension between old-world Gothic horror and the rising wave of raw 1970s brutality like Cry of the Banshee. Directed by Gordon Hessler and starring Vincent Price, it's a story steeped in witchcraft, hypocrisy, and blood-soaked revenge, the kind of film that feels torn between two centuries, both in its setting and its spirit. Price plays Lord Edward Whitman, a cruel magistrate who delights in hunting and executing supposed witches across the English countryside. But his violent zeal awakens something truly unholy, an ancient spirit of vengeance that takes human form and sets about destroying his family. What unfolds is part supernatural horror, part grim parable about power and corruption. The aristocratic estates and candlelit corridors recall Hammer Films' lush period horror, but Hessler twists that aesthetic into something uglier and more chaotic. The film pulses with a kind of feverish energy. It's full of quick zooms, frenetic cuts, and psychedelic flourishes that feel far removed from the stately Gothic-style audiences expected from Price. This was the moment when horror began shedding its sophistication, when the fog of the past started mixing with the grit of modern exploitation. While not as polished as his earlier collaborations, Price's performance gives the chaos a tragic center. By the end, as the Banshee's wail echoes over the landscape, you can feel the death of the old Gothic order and the birth of something crueler, stranger, and unmistakably 1970. House of Dark Shadows, 1970. At the dawn of the 1970s, horror was splitting in two. One half chasing realism and grit, the other clinging to the dying glow of Gothic grandeur. House of Dark Shadows sits squarely in that twilight, bridging eras with a mix of soap opera melodrama, Hammer-inspired atmosphere, and an unexpected level of bloodshed for its time. Adapted from the cult daytime series, the film follows Jonathan Frid as Barnabas Collins, a vampire cursed by love, buried for centuries, and awakened in the crumbling halls of Collinwood. But this isn't the romanticized creature of legend. Frid plays him as desperate, tragic, and increasingly feral, his charm fading with every drop of blood spilled. The Gothic trappings are all here: misty graveyards, flickering candelabras, storm-soaked mansions, yet everything feels sharper, louder, and more violent, as if the genteel horror of the 60s is being torn apart right before your eyes. Director Dan Curtis, who also produced the TV series, leans into that chaos. Gone are the prim sets and long speeches. This version is fast, brutal, and shockingly red for 1970. The film was a box office success, but what makes it fascinating now is how it captures the moment horror was mutating. The old monsters hadn't vanished yet, but their world was collapsing, replaced by the rawer, bloodier visions that would define the decade ahead. House of Dark Shadows isn't just a spin-off. It's a coffin lid creaking open on a new era of horror. Mark of the Devil, 1970. Few films announced the arrival of the 1970s horror era more violently than Mark of the Devil. Directed by Michael Armstrong and produced by Adrian Hoven, it took the witch-hunting formula popularized by Witchfinder General and stripped away every trace of restraint, leaving behind a film that was less a historical drama and more an endurance test. Set in 18th century Austria, it follows a young witch hunter who begins to question his faith and his mentor as he witnesses the depravity behind their crusade. But morality is quickly drowned in blood. Marketed with vomit bags and the tagline "Rated V for Violence," the film was designed to shock. Its torture scenes, teeth pulled, tongues torn, women branded, pushed boundaries that mainstream cinema hadn't yet dared cross. Yet beneath the exploitation lies a genuine anger, a disgust at authority disguised as piety. Herbert Lom gives the film weight as the cynical magistrate, while Udo Kier's youthful innocence crumbles under the horrors he helps perpetuate. It became infamous across Europe, banned in several countries and celebrated in others for its audacity. What makes it fascinating today isn't just its cruelty, but its reflection of a world losing faith in institutions, religious, political, even cinematic. Mark of the Devil isn't subtle or elegant. It's raw, confrontational, and deliberately unpleasant. But in 1970, that was exactly the point. Horror was shedding its decorum, and this film lit the pyre, with the witch and the viewer burning together. Dorian Gray, 1970. This German adaptation of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray takes the story's themes of vanity and moral decay and filters them through the decadent haze of European art horror. Directed by Massimo Dallamano, best known for his work in Italian thrillers, the film trades drawing room elegance for a cooler modern aesthetic. Gone are the Victorian trappings. In their place are sterile rooms, mirrored surfaces, and that eerie 1970 atmosphere where beauty and corruption are indistinguishable. Helmut Berger stars as Dorian, and he's perfect for this version. Handsome, detached, and unsettling in the way only early 70s European leads could be. Berger's performance captures the soul sickness of the role, but with an erotic chill that feels entirely of its time. His Dorian isn't just consumed by pleasure, he's alienated by it. Each indulgence drains a little more color from the world around him, while the infamous portrait, hidden away, growing uglier by the day, becomes a kind of psychedelic altar to sin. Dallamano's approach is slow and hypnotic, layering sex, art, and death into a visual experience closer to the blood rose than classic Gothic horror. There's little overt violence, yet the film radiates unease. It's a story about the sickness of beauty. And in 1970, that obsession with aesthetic decay felt prophetic. Dorian Gray may not scream like its grindhouse peers, but it whispers something far more haunting, that the prettiest monsters are always the hardest to recognize. Hatchet for the Honeymoon, 1970. Mario Bava's Hatchet for the Honeymoon opens like a fairy tale about love and marriage, and then quietly dismembers both. Set in the glittering world of fashion, it follows John Harrington, a handsome designer with a secret obsession. He's a serial killer compelled to murder brides in hopes of unlocking a repressed childhood memory. Unlike the slashers that would dominate the next decade, Bava's film isn't about shock or suspense. It's about descent. Every frame pulls us deeper into John's unraveling mind, a place where beauty and violence have become inseparable. Bava shoots the film with an almost painterly precision. Saturated reds, mirrored surfaces, and elegant camera moves turn Harrington's life into a surreal museum of vanity and guilt. Stephen Forsythe plays him as both charming and haunted, his voiceover offering a disturbingly calm window into madness. When his ghostly wife begins to torment him, part conscience, part curse, the film slips fully into the psychological horror that defined Italian cinema of the era. It stands as one of Bava's most personal works, a bridge between the Gothic horror of the 60s and 70s, the giallo thrillers that would soon dominate the European scene. It's stylish, strange, and deeply introspective, a film about a man dissecting love the same way he dissects his victims. Beneath its surface beauty lies a truth that defined 1970s horror, that the most terrifying monsters often hide behind perfect smiles. Scream and Scream Again, 1970. Few films capture the chaotic identity crisis of early 70s horror quite like Scream and Scream Again. On paper, it looks like a dream project. Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing together for the first time. But the result is something stranger and harder to pin down. Directed by Gordon Hessler and loosely based on a Peter Saxon novel, the film collides sci-fi conspiracy, police procedural, and serial killer thriller into a feverish hybrid that feels more like a bad dream than a coherent narrative. The story weaves between three seemingly unrelated threads: a killer draining victims of blood in London, a totalitarian government plotting world domination, and a scientist performing grotesque human experiments. None of it makes perfect sense, but that's part of its charm. Scream and Scream Again isn't about logic. It's about tone. Cold laboratories, steel corridors, and late-night city streets blur into a world where identity and humanity are literally being dissected. Hessler's kinetic editing and distorted pacing give the film an almost hallucinatory rhythm, as if it's channeling the anxiety of a world losing faith in both science and authority. Price, Lee, and Cushing's screen time is brief but symbolic. The old guard of Gothic horror trapped in a new mechanized nightmare is less a traditional horror film than a transitional artifact, one where vampires, spies, and cyborgs coexist uneasily. It's messy, stylish, and utterly unique, the exact kind of ambitious misfire that made 1970 such a fascinating, fractured year for horror. Girly, 1970. Behind the manicured lawns and nursery songs, a family of aristocrats lives in total delusion, a mother, nanny, and two adult children who never grew up. They play childish games, recite nursery rhymes, and lure unsuspecting strangers into their home, only to make them permanent parts of their fantasy. When a man they call new friend arrives, their fragile world begins to fracture, and playtime takes on a far more dangerous tone. Directed by Freddie Francis and originally released as Mumsy, Nanny, Sonny, and Girly, this twisted slice of British horror sits somewhere between dark comedy and psychological thriller. It's part social satire, part fairy tale gone wrong, the kind of movie that smiles sweetly while sharpening a knife behind its back. Francis shoots the estate like a dollhouse, bright and immaculate, yet hollow at the core. Every cheerful song and polite smile hides dependency, repression, and an unspoken rot that runs through the family. Vanessa Howard gives an unnervingly magnetic performance as Girly, charming, naive, and completely untethered from reality. The tension comes not from violence, but from anticipation, watching her navigate innocence and cruelty with the same playful grin. Girly is what happens when the class-bound decorum of 1960s British horror finally loses its mind. It's elegant and perverse, funny and frightening, a perfect example of the kind of psychosexual weirdness that defined the early 1970s, when horror no longer needed monsters, just people who forgot how to grow up. The Blood Rose, 1970. Obsession has always been one of horror's favorite subjects, but The Blood Rose takes it somewhere far more decadent and unsettling. Directed by Claude Mulot, this French fever dream follows a wealthy artist whose wife is horribly disfigured in a fire. Unable to accept her ruined beauty, he turns to a mysterious surgeon who claims he can restore her face through experimental grafts. But his methods come at a terrible cost. What follows is a descent into guilt, lust, and artistic madness, filmed with the detached beauty of a nightmare painted on canvas. Often cited as one of the first color French horror films, La Rose Écorchée looks less like a genre movie and more like an art installation slowly rotting from within. The mansion setting is all marble floors and floral arrangements, but the colors bleed. Deep reds, sickly greens, and pale flesh tones that seem to vibrate with unease. Mulaude's background in erotic cinema shows through, but instead of cheap titillation, the sensuality becomes part of the horror. Beauty and death are inseparable here, each feeding off the other. The pacing is languid, hypnotic, and disorienting, much like the films of Jean Rollin or Jess Franco, yet Mulaude keeps his story grounded in tragic obsession. The Blood Rose isn't about monsters. It's about the monstrous things people do in the name of love and perfection. In 1970, that blend of eroticism, surrealism, and despair felt new and transgressive. Decades later, it still looks like something unearthed from a dream too beautiful and too broken to survive in the light. The Wizard of Gore, 1970. Herschel Gordon Lewis was already known as the godfather of gore by the time The Wizard of Gore hit grindhouse screens, but this one felt different. Stranger, nastier, and more self-aware. On the surface, it's a simple shock show. A traveling magician named Montag the Magnificent performs gruesome illusions on stage, sawing, stabbing, and disemboweling volunteers who miraculously walk away unharmed, only to die horribly later, exactly as he described. But beneath the sleaze and splatter, there is something hypnotic about the way Lewis blurs performance and reality, as if he's cutting into the act of entertainment itself. Ray Sager plays Montag like a deranged carnival prophet, his voice booming with mock philosophy about the nature of illusion, death, and the audience's thirst for blood. The stage sequences are pure exploitation theater. Bright lights, exaggerated gore, and editing so jarring it feels like a nightmare broadcast through static. Yet there's an underlying intelligence to the chaos. Lewis seems to understand that the audience isn't just watching horror, they're complicit in it. The film pushed boundaries of taste and tone, its absurdity giving way to something almost avant-garde. By its surreal finale, where logic dissolves completely, The Wizard of Gore becomes more than a grindhouse gimmick. It's a reflection of 1970s cultural breakdown, where art, horror, and exploitation all started bleeding together. It's garish, cheap, and unforgettable, a carnival of carnage that proved low-budget horror could be both stupid and strangely profound. The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. Piers Haggard's The Blood on Satan's Claw is British folk horror set in 17th century rural England, where a plowman unearths something ancient and malevolent in the fields. As a demonic presence spreads through the village, the local youth fall under its influence, forming a cult, committing atrocities, and slowly transforming as the demon reclaims physical form through their corruption. The film captures genuinely disturbing atmosphere through its rural setting and period detail. This isn't Gothic castle horror, but earthbound evil emerging from the soil itself, corrupting a farming community through its children. Linda Hayden delivers an unsettling performance as the cult's leader, a teenage girl whose transformation from innocent to predatory feels organic and terrifying. Patrick Wymark brings authority as the judge who recognizes demonic influence and takes extreme measures to stop it. The practical effects for the demon's gradual manifestation, clawed limbs, fur-covered skin, inhuman features appearing on young bodies, are effectively disturbing. The violence has real weight, particularly sequences involving the cult's attacks on those who resist or discover their activities. Mark Wilkinson's score uses period instruments to create authentic yet unsettling soundscapes. The film's treatment of witch hunt hysteria is complex, the supernatural threat is real, but the community's response reveals how easily fear and righteousness justify cruelty. The youth cult's activities blur the line between demonic possession and adolescent rebellion finding violent outlet. The rural poverty and isolation make the village feel genuinely cut off from civilization, where old evils can resurface unchecked. The Blood on Satan's Claw stands alongside The Wicker Man and Witchfinder General as essential British folk horror, exploring how ancient evil and human cruelty intertwine in isolated communities where faith and superstition remain powerful forces. Fright, 1971. Peter Collinson's Fright is a lean British thriller that anticipates the babysitter in peril subgenre. A young woman accepts a babysitting job at an isolated house, unaware that the child's psychotic father, recently escaped from an asylum, is returning to reclaim his son. As night descends, the house becomes a trap where she must protect both herself and the child from a man whose mental breakdown makes him unpredictable and dangerous. Susan George plays the babysitter with escalating terror that feels earned rather than performed. She's not a helpless victim, but a resourceful young woman, facing a threat she's unprepared for in an environment designed to isolate her. Ian Bannon portrays the escaped patient with unsettling intensity, playing genuine mental illness rather than movie madness. His character is both pitiable and terrifying, damaged by trauma and obsession. Collinson keeps the tension ratcheted high through the confined setting and single-night time frame. The house itself becomes a character. Locked doors that provide temporary safety, windows that become potential entry points, phones that may or may not connect to help. The supporting cast includes Honor Blackman as the child's mother, whose own fear of her ex-husband adds backstory that makes the threat feel real. The film works because it treats its premise seriously, avoiding exploitation excess in favor of sustained psychological tension. The violence, when it comes, is brief and shocking rather than prolonged. The babysitter's growing awareness that she's trapped with a deeply disturbed man builds genuine dread through Collinson's patient direction. Fright represents British thriller cinema, efficiently delivering genre goods, well-crafted, tightly paced, and anchored by committed performances. It's workmanlike in the best sense, prioritizing craft and suspense over gimmicks. Don't Deliver Us from Evil, 1971. Joel Seria's Don't Deliver Us from Evil is French Catholic transgression taken to extremes. Two teenage girls at a strict religious boarding school form an intense friendship built on shared contempt for authority and fascination with the forbidden. They begin a private pact dedicated to evil, starting with minor cruelties and escalating to arson, seduction, and ultimately acts that push well beyond youthful rebellion into genuine horror. Jeanne Goupil and Catherine Wagoner play the girls with unsettling conviction, portraying privileged teenagers whose boredom and budding awareness curdles into something genuinely disturbing. They're not possessed or corrupted by external forces. Their descent into cruelty is purely self-directed exploration of transgression. The film treats their actions with documentary-like detachment, refusing to sensationalize or condemn, which makes everything more uncomfortable. Seria shoots the French countryside with beautiful cinematography that contrasts sharply with the girls' increasingly dark actions. The Catholic imagery, churches, rituals, religious instruction becomes the target of their games. They seduce men, commit crimes, and perform mock satanic rituals, treating evil as aesthetic choice and philosophical stance rather than supernatural corruption. The film caused scandal on release, banned in France and condemned by the Catholic Church for its provocative treatment of sexuality and religious transgression. Seria based the script loosely on the Parker Hume murder case, exploring how folie à deux can transform privileged boredom into genuine monstrosity. The climax delivers shocking acts that feel inevitable given the escalation. Don't Deliver Us from Evil remains confrontational and disturbing, a film about adolescent transgression that refuses to provide easy moral frameworks or comeuppance. It's French cinema at its most provocative, using horror elements to explore uncomfortable truths about rebellion, faith, and cruelty. Devil's Nightmare, 1971. Belgian horror from Jean Brismet follows 7 tourists stranded overnight in a Gothic castle whose owner harbors dark family history, a curse requiring one family member per generation to serve as succubus. As the guests settle in, a beautiful woman arrives and begins systematically targeting each visitor, exploiting their specific sins to claim their souls. Each death corresponds to one of the 7 deadly sins in this morality play, disguised as exploitation horror. Erica Blanc plays the succubus with seductive menace, appearing to each guest in forms that appeal to their particular weaknesses: greed, lust, pride, envy. The tourists are drawn broadly enough to embody their assigned sins while remaining functional characters rather than simple archetypes. Daniel Emilfork brings sinister presence as the castle's owner, clearly complicit but helpless, to stop the curse claiming new victims. The castle setting provides appropriately Gothic atmosphere. Stone corridors, shadowy chambers, and hidden passages where the succubus stalks her prey. The death sequences are creative, each tailored to both the victim's sin and their personal fears. The film's religious framework gives the horror moral dimension beyond typical slasher logic, though it never becomes preachy or heavy-handed. The practical effects range from subtle to spectacular, particularly the succubus's true demonic form revealed in brief glimpses. The film's pacing allows each guest their moment before the inevitable fall, building dread as the survivors realize the pattern. The climax involves genuine theological stakes, as a priest among the guests attempts to combat demonic forces. Devil's Nightmare represents European horror's willingness to blend religious allegory with exploitation elements, creating something that's simultaneously morality tale and creature feature. It's modest, but effective Gothic horror that takes its theological framework seriously while delivering genre thrills. I Drink Your Blood, 1970. David Durston's I Drink Your Blood is drive-in exploitation madness, about a satanic hippie cult that terrorizes a small town. When a young boy seeks revenge after the cultists assault his grandfather, he injects rabies-infected blood into meat pies they eat. The cultists transform into frothing, homicidal maniacs who spread the infection through the town, turning rural America into a gore-soaked nightmare of rabid violence. The film's premise is gleefully absurd, and Durston commits completely. The cultists, led by Bhaskar Roy Chowdhury's Horace Bones, are counterculture stereotypes cranked to exploitation extremes, satanic rituals, free love, and violent contempt for straight society. Once infected, they become rabid animals, frothing and attacking with savage intensity. The practical gore effects are impressively messy for the era, with axe attacks, impalements, and rabies-induced carnage. Shot guerrilla style in upstate New York with minimal budget, the film captures authentic small-town locations that ground the outrageous premise. The cast of unknowns throws themselves into the material with commitment that makes the absurdity work. The infection spreads with exponential speed, transforming more victims into rabid killers, until the town descends into complete chaos. I Drink Your Blood arrived during the early 70s explosion of violent exploitation cinema, pushing boundaries alongside Night of the Living Dead in demonstrating how far independent horror could go. The film was heavily cut for its initial release, with the original version's extreme violence restored only years later. It represents drive-in horror, at its most unhinged, cheap, violent, and gleefully offensive. The film spawned the equally outrageous I Eat Your Skin as a double bill, though the two films are completely unrelated. It remains a cult favorite for audiences seeking early 70s exploitation that delivers exactly what its lurid title promises. Demons, 1971. Toshio Matsumoto's Demons is Japanese period horror as hallucinogenic nightmare, a film that uses the framework of samurai-era tragedy to explore obsession, madness, and the disintegration of identity. A woman's affair with a younger man spirals into violence when her samurai husband discovers the betrayal. What follows isn't straightforward revenge, but a descent into psychological horror where reality fragments, time becomes unstable, and the boundaries between past trauma and present collapse entirely. Matsumoto employs avant-garde techniques that shatter traditional narrative. Split screens, overlapping timelines, distorted imagery, and sound design that assaults rather than guides. The film operates like a fever dream, where the same events replay with variations, each iteration revealing new layers of psychological damage. Katsuo Nakamura plays the lover with increasing desperation as he realizes he's trapped in a cycle he can't escape. The period setting becomes increasingly claustrophobic as Matsumoto's experimental approach transforms historical drama into something nightmarish. The violence, when it erupts, is sudden and disturbing, but the true horror comes from the relentless psychological unraveling. The film's treatment of female desire and rage anticipates later explorations of repression and transgression in Japanese horror. Demons never found wide distribution outside Japan and remains one of the more challenging entries in early 70s international horror. It's art cinema using horror framework to explore extreme psychological states, demanding patience and willingness to surrender to its fragmented, non-linear approach. For viewers seeking conventional scares, it's baffling. For those open to experimental horror, it's mesmerizing. The Brotherhood of Satan, 1971. Bernard Mickey-Vidy's The Brotherhood of Satan traps travelers in a small California town where children are disappearing and adults are dying in bizarre accidents that seem to involve toys come to life. As the protagonists investigate, they discover a satanic coven of elderly townspeople attempting to achieve immortality by transferring their souls into the children's bodies through a cult ritual. The film's premise is genuinely unsettling. Senior citizens as satanic cultists, using innocent children for supernatural life extension. Strother Martin leads the coven with quiet menace, playing the group's leader as someone who believes absolutely in what they're doing. The elderly cultists aren't cackling villains, but desperate people facing mortality and choosing damnation over death. The practical effects for the toy-related deaths are creatively executed. A man crushed by a giant toy tank, others killed by oversized dolls and soldiers. These sequences blend dark whimsy with genuine horror, transforming childhood objects into instruments of occult violence. The children themselves are portrayed as innocent victims, slowly falling under the coven's influence through rituals and conditioning. The small-town setting creates effective isolation. Our protagonists can't leave, and outside help seems impossibly distant. The community's complicity, whether through fear or active participation, makes trust impossible. The film's low budget forces creativity in staging the supernatural elements, using suggestion and careful framing rather than elaborate effects. The Brotherhood of Satan represents early 70s occult horror finding American voice, blending satanic panic with folk horror isolation. It's modest but effective genre filmmaking that takes its premise seriously while delivering creative scares and genuine unease about community secrets and the corruption of innocence. Daughters of Darkness, 1971. Harry Kummel's Daughters of Darkness is vampire cinema as stylish, erotic nightmare set in an off-season Belgian seaside hotel. A newlywed couple arrives and encounters Countess Bathory and her young companion, elegant travelers whose timeless beauty and predatory interest transform the honeymoon into psychosexual horror. As the Countess seduces both husband and wife, their relationship fractures and hidden perversions surface. Delphine Seyrig plays the Countess with aristocratic elegance and barely concealed menace, her performance all-knowing smiles and theatrical gestures that suggest centuries of experience manipulating mortals. Danielle Ouimet and John Carlin portray the couple with appropriate naivety that gradually reveals darker currents. Andrea Rao brings otherworldly beauty as the Countess's companion, silent witness and occasional participant. The hotel setting is crucial. A grand Art Deco palace emptied for winter, all gleaming surfaces and vast spaces where the four characters play out their twisted games. Cinematographer Giuseppe Pinori bathes everything in rich colors and elegant compositions, creating visual beauty that contrasts with the emotional and physical violence. The film's approach to vampirism is ambiguous. Are they supernatural creatures or simply ageless predators who've perfected their hunting? Kumail blends vampire mythology with psychosexual exploration, treating bloodlust and desire as inseparable. The violence, when it erupts, is sudden and shocking against the film's measured elegance. The Countess represents both liberating transgression and predatory corruption, offering freedom that comes with terrible cost. Daughters of Darkness remains one of the most stylish vampire films ever made, prioritizing atmosphere and eroticism over traditional horror mechanics. It's European art cinema, using vampire mythology to explore power, desire, and the thin line between seduction and destruction. Short Night of Glass Dolls, 1971. Aldo Lotto's directorial debut is Italian giallo filtered through Kafkaesque nightmare. A journalist awakens to discover he's completely paralyzed, mistaken for dead, and about to be autopsied. Conscious but unable to move or communicate, he lies in the morgue while his mind races through the events that led to this moment, his girlfriend's disappearance in Prague, and his investigation into a conspiracy involving powerful figures and missing young women. The film's structure is brilliantly unsettling. We experience the protagonist's helpless terror in the present, while flashbacks reveal his doomed investigation. Jean Sorel plays the paralyzed journalist with voiceover narration that conveys mounting panic as medical examiners prepare to dissect his living body. The Prague locations provide Cold War atmosphere. Beautiful but oppressive, a city where Western journalists asking wrong questions tend to vanish. Lotto builds dread through the ticking clock structure. Each flashback brings us closer to understanding the conspiracy, while the present tense sequences show doctors moving methodically toward the autopsy. The film's treatment of institutional power and conspiracy feels genuinely paranoid, suggesting corruption that extends from street level to the highest echelons of society. The giallo elements, mysterious disappearances, amateur investigation, conspiracy, blend with body horror and political thriller. Ennio Morricone's score adds layers of unease, his music shifting between melancholic and nightmarish as the dual timelines converge. The practical effects for the paralysis sequences make the protagonist's condition viscerally uncomfortable. Short Night of Glass Dolls represents giallo at its most cerebral and disturbing, prioritizing psychological horror and conspiracy paranoia over elaborate kill sequences. The climax delivers both narrative resolution and visceral horror that justified the film's patient buildup. The Fifth Chord, 1971. Luigi Bazzoni's The Fifth Chord is giallo as Antonioni-influenced art film, a murder mystery more interested in alienation and atmosphere than typical genre thrills. An alcoholic journalist investigates a series of attacks on people connected to his social circle, each victim targeted on days of personal significance. As he digs deeper, the investigation becomes personal odyssey through Rome's empty spaces and hollow relationships. Franco Nero stars as the journalist, playing him with detached cool that barely masks self-destructive tendencies. He's an unreliable protagonist. His drinking, his fragmented memory, his complicated relationships all make him potential suspect as much as investigator. Sylvia Monti and Pamela Tiffin play women in his orbit, each harboring secrets that complicate the mystery. Bazzoni and cinematographer Vittorio Storaro create stunning visual compositions, Rome shot in cold blues and stark architectural frames that emphasize isolation and geometric precision. The city becomes a maze of modern buildings and empty piazzas where characters are dwarfed by their environments. Ennio Morricone's score is jarringly experimental, using industrial sounds and discordant elements that create unease rather than traditional thriller tension. The murder sequences are staged with visual flair but minimal gore, emphasizing the act's psychological impact over exploitation value. The film's pace is deliberately slow, prioritizing mood and character over plot mechanics. Red herrings and ambiguous clues accumulate without the typical giallo reveals, keeping audiences uncertain about both killer identity and protagonist reliability. The Fifth Chord divides giallo fans. Some find it pretentious and slow, others consider it the genre's most artistically ambitious entry. It represents Italian thriller cinema, reaching toward art house respectability while maintaining genre framework, creating something beautiful, cold, and genuinely unsettling. Blacula, 1972. William Marshall brings Shakespearean gravitas to the title role in William Crane's landmark blaxploitation horror. An 18th century African prince named Mamuwalde seeks Dracula's help ending the slave trade, only to be cursed with vampirism and sealed in a coffin for 2 centuries. When antique hunters ship his coffin to 1970s Los Angeles, Blacula awakens in a world transformed, beginning a bloodthirsty rampage while searching for a woman who might be his reincarnated wife. Marshall refuses to play the role as camp, instead bringing dignity and genuine tragedy to a character cursed for fighting injustice. His commanding presence elevates the material considerably, delivering classical horror performance in exploitation framework. Vanetta McGee plays Tina, the photographer who resembles Mamuwalde's lost love, their romance adding unexpected emotional weight. The film doesn't shy from its blaxploitation elements, funky soundtrack, contemporary LA settings, soul music clubs, while maintaining genuine Gothic horror atmosphere. The practical vampire effects are solid for the era, with Marshall's transformation makeup creating genuinely monstrous visage. Gene Page's score blends orchestral horror with funk grooves perfectly. Blacula succeeded both commercially and culturally, proving Black audiences wanted horror representation and that blaxploitation could encompass any genre. It spawned sequels Scream, Blacula Scream, and opened doors for more diverse horror casting. The Night Stalker, 1972. A Las Vegas reporter investigates a series of murders where victims are drained of blood, gradually realizing the killer is an actual vampire. Dan Curtis's television movie became a phenomenon, drawing massive ratings and proving horror could dominate primetime. Darren McGavin plays Carl Kolchak, the rumpled journalist whose dogged investigation puts him at odds with authorities more concerned with covering up supernatural truth than protecting citizens. McGavin's performance defines the film. Cynical, persistent, delivering sardonic narration that makes Kolchak feel lived in rather than heroic. He's a working-class reporter chasing truth even when it costs him everything. The vampire, played by Barry Atwater, is genuinely frightening. Not romantic or seductive, but monstrous predator with superhuman strength. Richard Matheson's script balances procedural investigation with mounting horror, treating the vampire as solvable problem, requiring research and methodology. Curtis shoots Las Vegas with documentary-like attention to actual locations, the city's glittering facade hiding predatory darkness. The confrontations between Kolchak and the vampire are staged with real tension, emphasizing the creature's physical superiority. The Night Stalker's success led to sequel The Night Strangler and eventually a television series, establishing template for investigative horror that influenced The X-Files and countless others. It proved television horror could be genuinely effective and commercially successful. The Other, 1972. Twin boys live on a rural Connecticut farm in the 1930s, one outgoing and mischievous, the other withdrawn and disturbed. After a series of tragic accidents plague the family, their grandmother begins teaching them an old family game involving projecting consciousness into other beings. Robert Mulligan adapts Thomas Tryan's novel into slow-burn psychological horror that reveals its cards gradually. Chris and Martin Udvarnaki play the twins with unsettling authenticity, their performances capturing childhood dynamics while hinting at something profoundly wrong. Uta Hagen delivers a powerful turn as the Russian grandmother whose mystical teachings might have unleashed something dangerous. Diana Muldaur and John Ritter populate the family with characters whose fates become increasingly grim as the summer progresses. Mulligan shoots the period setting with Norman Rockwell beauty that makes the horror more disturbing by contrast. The rural farm should be idyllic childhood paradise, but cinematographer Robert Surtees captures shadows and spaces that feel threatening. Jerry Goldsmith's score adds layers of unease to scenes that appear innocent on surface. The film builds dread through suggestion and behavioral observation rather than explicit violence, trusting audiences to piece together what's happening. The climax delivers both revelation and genuine horror, recontextualizing everything that came before. The Other represents intelligent literary horror, translated to film with patience and craft, never condescending to audiences or simplifying complex psychological territory. Whoever Slew Auntie Rue, 1972. Shelley Winters plays a wealthy American widow living in England who's never recovered from her daughter's death, keeping the child's mummified corpse in a locked nursery. Each Christmas, she invites orphans to her mansion for elaborate parties, but when two resourceful children discover her secret, they become convinced she's a witch, planning to fatten and eat them like Hansel and Gretel. Winters delivers characteristically unhinged performance, playing grief and madness with theatrical commitment that makes Auntie Rue simultaneously pitiable and threatening. Mark Lester and Chloe Franks play the orphans whose imaginations transform tragedy into fairy tale horror. Their certainty that she's a witch becoming self-fulfilling prophecy. The film operates as darkened version of Hansel and Gretel, where the children's assumptions drive them to increasing cruelty toward a woman who's damaged but not actually dangerous in the ways they imagine. Curtis Harrington directs with Gothic atmosphere, shooting the mansion's Christmas decorations and elaborate parties with visual richness that contrasts with the emotional decay beneath. The mummified child is genuinely disturbing practical effect, Rue's preservation of her daughter's corpse crossing from grief into grotesque delusion. The film's tragedy comes from misunderstanding escalating into violence, children's storybook logic meeting adult mental illness with horrific results. Whoever Slew Auntie Rue represents early 70s horror's interest in psychological damage and grande dame guignol, using a fading star's intensity to explore grief's destructive power. Vampire Circus, 1972. A cursed village faces supernatural revenge when a traveling circus arrives 15 years after the townspeople destroyed a vampire. The performers are all vampires or their servants, targeting the descendants of those who participated in the original staking. Hammer Films delivers one of their stranger entries, blending gothic horror with circus spectacle and psychedelic visuals unusual for the studio. Adrian Corey, Anthony Higgins, and John Mulder Brown populate the vampire circus with performers who seduce and destroy with theatrical flair. The circus setting allows for creative staging, trapeze artists who transform mid-flight, a Hall of Mirrors sequence where reflections don't match reality, a panther that's really a shape-shifting vampire. Robert Young directs with more visual experimentation than typical Hammer productions, using colored lighting and distorted angles. The practical transformation effects are ambitious for Hammer, with vampires changing into animals through dissolve effects and makeup work. The mirror maze sequence is particularly effective, using practical sets and careful blocking to create disorienting space where reality becomes unreliable. The village's plague subplot adds another layer of dread. They're already suffering when the vampires arrive to finish them. The film's sexual frankness pushes beyond Hammer's usual restraint, with the circus performers using seduction as hunting method. Vampire Circus represents Hammer attempting to modernize their formula with contemporary filmmaking techniques while maintaining their Gothic roots, creating something that feels transitional between their classic period and attempts to remain relevant in changing horror landscape. Demons of the Mind, 1972. An Austrian baron keeps his teenage children imprisoned in his estate, convinced they've inherited their mother's violent madness. When a traveling priest arrives offering experimental treatments and local villagers begin dying violently, questions arise about whether the children are actually dangerous or if their father's obsession has created the very madness he fears. Peter Sykes directs one of Hammer's most psychologically complex films. Robert Hardy plays the Baron with intensity bordering on mania, his attempts to cure his children becoming abuse justified through aristocratic authority and pseudoscience. Shane Bryant and Gillian Hills portray the imprisoned siblings with appropriate damage and confusion. Patrick Magee brings unsettling presence as the priest whose treatments feel more like torture. The film explores themes of hereditary madness, incestuous obsession, and how patriarchal control creates the very dysfunction it claims to prevent. Cinematographer Arthur Grant shoots with more visual experimentation than typical Hammer productions, using expressionistic angles and fragmented editing to convey psychological instability. The practical gore effects are surprisingly explicit for Hammer, particularly during the village attack sequences. The film's sexual frankness and psychological complexity push beyond the studio's usual boundaries, creating something that feels more European art film than traditional Gothic horror. The ambiguity about whether the madness is real or constructed makes the horror more disturbing. Is this supernatural curse or generational trauma perpetuated through abuse? Demons of the Mind represents Hammer attempting to modernize and deepen their approach, trading simple monster stories for complex psychological territory. They're Coming to Get You. 1972. Jane arrives in London to stay with her sister and immediately plunges into paranoid nightmare. Visions of ritualistic violence, strange figures following her, and growing certainty that her life is in danger. Sergio Martino's Italian Giallo blends the genre's typical mystery thriller elements with occult horror and psychological uncertainty about what's real versus hallucination. Edwige Fenech plays Jane with escalating terror, her performance capturing genuine mental deterioration as evidence mounts that either she's losing her mind or being targeted by satanic cult. George Hilton provides her skeptical boyfriend, while Ivan Rasimov brings sinister charisma to the mysterious blue-eyed man who appears in her visions and reality. Marina Malfatti rounds out the cast as the neighbor who introduces Jane to the occult group that might be salvation or trap. Bruno Nicolai's score blends giallo jazz with occult atmosphere perfectly. The ritual sequences are impressively staged, with elaborate ceremonial elements and genuinely unsettling imagery. The film keeps audiences uncertain about Jane's reliability. Are the visions real supernatural threats or manifestations of trauma? The practical effects for the violent sequences are characteristically Italian in their explicitness. The climax forces revelation that recontextualizes the preceding ambiguity. They're Coming to Get You represents giallo expanding beyond crime thriller into occult territory, creating something that's simultaneously mystery, horror, and paranoid thriller about trust and perception. Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, 1972. A theater troupe travels to a remote island cemetery for their director's twisted ritual, performing a ceremony to raise the dead as ultimate theatrical experience. What starts as elaborate prank becomes genuine nightmare when the dead actually rise and trap the group in a cottage, forcing them to survive until dawn. Bob Clark's early film operates as dark comedy horror, with surprising bite beneath its amateur aesthetics. Alan Ormsby, who also wrote the script, plays the insufferably theatrical director, whose arrogance and cruelty toward his troupe make him thoroughly unlikable. The supporting cast plays broadly, their performances matching the film's satirical edge about theater people and artistic pretension. The first half deliberately moves slowly, building character dynamics, and allowing the director's obnoxious behavior to create genuine audience desire for consequences. When the zombies finally rise, Clark stages their siege with real effectiveness despite obvious budget constraints. The makeup effects are crude, but achieve atmosphere through sheer commitment and numbers. The zombies move with genuine menace, surrounding the cottage in steadily growing horde. Clark shoots the nighttime sequences with genuinely eerie lighting, making the island feel isolated and dangerous. The dark comedy tone shifts into legitimate horror as the group realizes their situation is hopeless, and their director's arrogance has doomed them. Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things gained cult status through midnight screenings and home video, appreciated for its mean-spirited humor and surprisingly effective zombie siege, despite clearly limited resources. Deathline, 1972. London Underground workers discover evidence of missing persons in abandoned tunnel sections, leading to the horrifying truth. A descendant of Victorian railway workers trapped in a 19th century cave-in has survived in the tunnels for generations, now a deformed cannibal hunting modern commuters for food and companionship. Gary Sherman's British horror operates as both creature feature and surprisingly empathetic tragedy. Donald Pleasance plays the detective investigating disappearances with working-class weariness, his performance grounded even as evidence points toward impossible explanations. David Ladd and Sharon Gurney portray the young couple who stumble into the creature's lair. Hugh Armstrong delivers remarkable performance as the Tunnel Dweller, playing him not as simple monster, but as damaged, lonely being, trying to survive using the only methods he knows. His attempts at speech, garbled, broken English mixed with animalistic sounds, make him pitiable despite his violence. Sherman shoots the London Underground with claustrophobic intensity, the tunnels becoming maze where civilization's veneer is stripped away. The practical makeup effects for the creature emphasize his humanity beneath deformity, rather than making him purely monstrous. The diseased, decaying woman he keeps as companion is disturbing precisely because it reveals his desperate need for connection. The film's most famous line, the creature's garbled "mind the doors," becomes tragic mimicry of railway announcements he's heard for decades. Deathline balances horror with unexpected compassion, understanding that monsters are often made by circumstance rather than born evil. Tower of Evil, 1972. Investigators arrive at a remote lighthouse island where archaeological students were found dead or catatonic, uncovering evidence of ancient Phoenician treasure and ritualistic violence. As a new expedition explores the ruins, the survivors' flashbacks reveal what happened during the first visit, while present-day investigators face the same threat. Jim O'Connelly's British horror blends slasher elements with archaeological mystery. The dual timeline structure builds tension as past horrors inform present danger. The lighthouse setting creates effective isolation, the island becoming trap where escape proves impossible once violence begins. The practical gore effects are surprisingly brutal for 1972 British horror, with explicit violence that pushes beyond typical restraint. The Phoenician angle provides mythology justifying the carnage while hinting at ancient evil protecting buried treasure. O'Connelly stages the attack sequences with real intensity, the killer moving through cramped lighthouse interiors with methodical efficiency. The film's structure influenced later slasher cinema, particularly the summer camp isolation and archaeological expedition setup that would become common. Tower of Evil represents British horror, embracing more explicit violence and American-style body counts while maintaining Gothic atmosphere, creating transitional work between hammer elegance and grindhouse brutality that would dominate later in the decade. The Creeping Flesh, 1973. In Victorian England, a scientist returns from an expedition with something that should have stayed buried, a massive, ancient skeleton unlike anything found before. When its bones are exposed to water, the impossible happens. New flesh begins to form. As his obsession grows, so does the horror, blurring the line between discovery and damnation. The Creeping Flesh brings together two titans of British horror, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, in one of their most atmospheric collaborations. Directed by Freddie Francis, the film feels steeped in madness and melancholy, mixing Gothic imagery with early hints of body horror. Cushing's performance is heartbreaking as a man consumed by guilt and ambition, while Lee's cold precision adds gravity to the story's moral descent. The film's title might sound like drive-in pulp, but the execution is pure Gothic tragedy. The laboratory scenes glow with eerie color, the fog-choked streets hum with dread, and the slow reanimation of the creature feels as much psychological as supernatural. It's horror built on ideas, of science gone too far, of men trying to play God, and of the sins that can't be contained once they're unearthed. By the time it ends, The Creeping Flesh feels less like a monster movie and more like a nightmare about curiosity itself. Haunting, intelligent, and quietly devastating. And Now the Screaming Starts, 1973. An idyllic marriage turns into a Gothic nightmare in this eerie slice of British horror from Amicus Productions. Set in the late 18th century, it follows a young bride who arrives at her husband's ancestral estate, a grand, decaying mansion where the past refuses to rest. What begins as a romantic escape quickly spirals into terror as she's haunted by visions of a vengeful specter and the brutal secrets buried within her new family's walls. And Now the Screaming Starts delivers the lush atmosphere and brooding dread that defined Amicus at its peak. Director Roy Ward Baker builds a sense of creeping unease, letting each corridor and candlelit room feel soaked in guilt and decay. Peter Cushing, Herbert Lom, and Patrick Magee add gravitas to the madness, grounding the supernatural story in a sense of aristocratic rot. Unlike the studio's anthology horrors, this is a single sustained tale, one steeped in gothic melodrama, bloody curses, and psychological unraveling. Every detail serves its sense of claustrophobia and doom. And now the screaming starts. Stands as one of the last great gasps of classic British horror before the genre fully descended into modern brutality. Elegant, ghostly, and soaked in old-world terror. Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, 1973. In the quiet shadows of the Depression-era South, a young girl named Lila Lee receives a letter from her estranged father, a fugitive hiding in a forgotten town, surrounded by swamps and secrets. Her journey to find him leads her far from innocence and into the clutches of a mysterious woman named Lemora, whose Gothic mansion hides something ancient, alluring, and unspeakably corrupt. Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural is unlike anything else from the 1970s horror scene, a haunting mix of Southern Gothic, fairy tale, and fever dream. Directed by Richard Blackburn, it walks a razor's edge between beauty and decay, mixing religious imagery with dreamlike menace. Leslie Taplin's performance as Lemora radiates both charm and danger, while Cheryl Smith brings heartbreaking vulnerability to Lila's descent into darkness. The film's low budget only adds to its atmosphere. Grainy textures and soft lighting create a hazy, otherworldly feel, like a nightmare half-remembered. Beneath its strange elegance lies a coming-of-age story twisted into something deeply unsettling, where purity and corruption blur into the same haunting vision. Lemora isn't for everyone, but for those drawn to ethereal, uncanny horror, it's a rare gem, a hypnotic journey through innocence lost, faith-tested, and the seductive power of the unknown. Warlock Moon, 1973. A young college student takes a spontaneous trip with a charming stranger to explore an abandoned spa resort deep in the countryside. The place is beautiful in a faded, ghostly way. Crumbling walls, empty pools, a ballroom still echoing with forgotten music. But the longer they stay, the clearer it becomes that the ruins aren't empty at all, and something within them has been waiting. Warlock Moon is one of those eerie, offbeat relics of early 70s horror, part ghost story, part backwoods nightmare. Directed by Bill Verne, it blends the innocent tone of a made-for-TV mystery with sudden bursts of grindhouse dread. Laurie Walters gives the film a real sense of vulnerability, her curiosity turning slowly into fear, while Joe Spano's easy charm masks something you can't quite place until it's too late. Shot with muted colors and quiet pacing, it feels less like a traditional horror movie and more like a bad dream that keeps changing shape. You're never sure if you're watching a love story, a ghost story, or a trap closing in slow motion. It's cheap, strange, and uneven. But that's what makes it work. Warlock Moon feels haunted by its own uncertainty, caught between the romantic and the macabre, and somehow finding something memorable in the middle of both. Don't Look in the Basement, 1973. Deep in rural Texas, a young nurse arrives at a remote asylum to start a new job, only to discover that the doctor is dead, the patients are running the place, and the line between sanity and madness no longer exists. Every room hides a new kind of danger, and every face seems to wear a mask of calm just waiting to crack. Released under other titles, including The Forgotten, this low-budget shocker from director S.F. Brownrigg became a staple of drive-in horror and late-night TV. Shot on a shoestring and drenched in southern sweat, it feels claustrophobic and unpredictable, where even silence carries a kind of menace. The amateur cast and raw camera work give it a strange authenticity. It doesn't feel performed so much as found. What it lacks in polish, it makes up for in atmosphere and sheer unease. The creaking floors, dim lighting, and chaotic editing make the entire asylum feel alive, pulsing with fear and confusion. Like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which came just a year later, Don't Look in the Basement proves that you don't need money to make something that gets under your skin. It's grim, sweaty, and deeply unsettling, a cracked mirror reflecting the madness of 1970s American horror. Pigs, 1973. On the edge of nowhere sits a crumbling roadside diner run by a quiet old man and his nervous young tenant. The food's cheap, the coffee's stale, and the pigs out back are always hungry. When a string of strangers starts to disappear, it becomes clear that something much darker than bad luck is feeding this farm. Also known under half a dozen titles including The Strange Exorcism of Lynn Hart and Daddy's Deadly Darling, this 1970s grindhouse oddity is a slow, sweaty descent into rural madness. Directed by Mark Lawrence, it plays like a cross between Psycho and Eaten Alive, filtered through drive-in grit and feverish paranoia. Toni Lawrence gives a raw, fragile performance as the young woman hiding from her past, while her aging caretaker shifts between fatherly warmth and something quietly monstrous. The movie moves at its own strange rhythm, somewhere between psychological breakdown and regional horror. The low-budget setting and sun-bleached cinematography give it a grim realism that only makes its surreal, dreamlike final act hit harder. Pigs is one of those films that feels discovered rather than watched. Grimy, strange, and utterly unique. It's the kind of story that smells like dust and fear, a cracked window into 1970s exploitation where morality rots faster than the bodies. The Death Wheelers, 1973. In the grey sprawl of early 1970s England, a motorcycle gang called the Living Dead tears through small towns and open roads like ghosts with nothing left to lose. Led by the arrogant and oddly philosophical Tom Latham, they live fast, die young, and, thanks to a mysterious pact with forces beyond comprehension, come roaring back from the grave to do it all over again. Also known as Psychomania, this is British horror filtered through a mod daydream of rebellion and death. Director Don Sharp crafts a world where the afterlife feels oddly mundane, where immortality just means endless wheelies and reckless abandon. Nicky Henson plays Tom with wild-eyed charm, part rock star, part cult leader, while Beryl Reid and George Sanders lend the film an eerie weight as the adults complicit in his dark discovery. The mix of horror, counterculture, and absurdity gives it a one-of-a-kind tone, equal parts stylish and ridiculous. The film's haunting folk soundtrack, bleak English landscapes, and deadpan performances create a surreal mood that's impossible to shake. Few movies capture the strange optimism of early 70s occult cinema like this one, where even death feels like another kind of freedom. The Death Wheelers is both ridiculous and profound, a perfect midnight movie about the price of never growing up. Invasion of the Bee Girls, 1973. When a series of mysterious deaths begins to plague a small California town, the victims all share one strange detail. Each man has literally been loved to death. The investigation leads to a secret research facility experimenting with radiation and genetics, where a seductive swarm of women may hold the key to the mystery. These aren't femme fatales in the usual sense. They're something far more dangerous and far less human. Invasion of the Bee Girls is a strange hybrid of science fiction, erotic thriller, and low-budget paranoia, a kind of drive-in mutation of Village of the Damned and The Stepford Wives. Directed by Dennis Sanders and written by Nicholas Meyer before Star Trek II fame, it turns its pulpy premise into a surprisingly sharp satire about fear of female sexuality and scientific overreach. The film's tone swings from dead-serious investigation to absurd B-movie excess. But it's that inconsistency that gives it life. The crisp 70s cinematography, sterile laboratories, and sun-baked exteriors all hide a pulsing weirdness underneath. It's the kind of movie that feels both trashy and smart. One foot in exploitation, the other in commentary. Invasion of the Bee Girls isn't subtle, but it's unforgettable. A buzzing, bizarre time capsule of 1970s genre filmmaking at its most unapologetically strange. Torso, 1973. In a quiet Italian university town, a string of brutal murders begins to spread panic among a group of young art students. Someone in a black scarf is stalking women through the winding streets and misty countryside, killing with surgical precision. When a few survivors retreat to a secluded villa for safety, the killer follows, and the real nightmare begins. Sergio Martino's Torso is often considered the bridge between the stylized giallo thrillers of the early 70s and the slasher films that followed. It combines the visual elegance of Italian horror, bold color, hypnotic camera work, and eerie jazz, with a raw intensity that would soon define American exploitation. Susie Kendall leads the cast with quiet vulnerability, grounding the film's violence in genuine fear rather than spectacle. What sets Torso apart is Martino's control of tone. The first half builds with erotic tension and mystery. The second turns into pure survival horror, stripped of music and glamour. What's left is something cold, human, and terrifyingly real. Stylish, shocking, and influential, Torso feels like the moment 1970s horror stopped looking at the killer as art and started feeling their breath on the back of your neck. The Baby, 1973. When a young social worker is sent to check on a reclusive family, she finds a case unlike anything she's seen. A full-grown man kept in diapers and treated like a child by his domineering mother and two disturbed sisters. But as her concern turns to curiosity, she uncovers something far more disturbing than neglect. The Baby is one of the strangest and most unsettling films of the 1970s, a psychological horror story disguised as domestic melodrama. Directed by Ted Post, it starts with a tone of grim realism before slowly peeling back into madness. Anjanette Comer plays the social worker with quiet determination, while Ruth Roman dominates the screen as the controlling matriarch, walking a perfect line between camp and cruelty. The film's low-budget look and made-for-TV pacing make its descent into depravity all the more shocking. Every smile feels false, every conversation tinged with threat, and every brightly lit suburban room hides something rotting beneath the surface. By the time its final reveal arrives, The Baby has gone from strange to downright transgressive, a story about control, dependency, and how far people will go to keep their version of love intact. It's uncomfortable, unforgettable, and utterly one of a kind, a true relic of 70s horror that still feels wrong in all the right ways. Peopletoys, 1974. Sean McGregor's Peopletoys, also known as Devil Times 5 and The Horrible House on the Hill, is nasty exploitation about 5 children escaping from a van crash near an isolated winter retreat where wealthy adults have gathered. The children infiltrate the house, and their innocent appearance masks homicidal intent as they systematically eliminate the adults through creative violence. The child performances are genuinely unsettling, portraying damaged kids who treat violence as game. Each child has distinct personality: the nun, the brain, the soldier, and their coordinated attacks suggest pack mentality rather than individual madness. The adult cast includes Gene Evans and Sorrel Book, playing wealthy vacationers whose privilege makes them oblivious to danger until too late. The practical gore effects are impressively brutal for mid-70s exploitation, with deaths including bathtub electrocution, piranha attack, and machete violence. The children's methods are creative and cruel, using the isolated winter setting and the adults' underestimation to their advantage. The film doesn't explain the children's behavior or provide redemptive arc. They're simply predators exploiting adult assumptions about childhood innocence. The snowy mountain setting creates genuine isolation, with the retreat becoming trap, where calling for help is impossible, and escape through winter conditions is deadly. The film's pacing is deliberate, building tension as the children insinuate themselves into the household before revealing their true nature. Peopletoys is nasty, exploitative, and surprisingly effective at creating dread through violated expectations about children. The film traffics in transgressive content that made it controversial: kids as unredeemable killers, adults dying helplessly, but commits to its premise without apology. It represents mid-70s horror's willingness to push boundaries and explore taboo subject matter, delivering exactly what its lurid premise promises. The Cars That Ate Paris, 1974. Peter Weir's debut feature is Australian horror comedy about a small town that survives economically by causing car accidents, salvaging vehicles, and either recruiting or disposing of survivors. Arthur Waldo becomes trapped in Paris after a crash kills his brother, slowly realizing the community's prosperity depends on orchestrated crashes, and that escape might be impossible. Terry Camilleri plays Arthur with appropriate bewilderment, an everyman caught in nightmare community where normal social contracts don't apply. John Millen brings menacing authority as the mayor who maintains Paris's economic model through violence and manipulation. The townspeople treat their predatory lifestyle as simple pragmatism, creating cognitive dissonance between their pleasant small-town veneer and homicidal reality. The modified cars are the film's visual signature. Vehicles transformed into armored, weaponized rolling sculptures that patrol the roads causing accidents. These boy racers operate as town's youth, expressing rebellion through vehicular chaos, their cars bristling with spikes and improvised armor. The practical vehicle modifications and stunt work create genuinely impressive automotive mayhem. Weir shoots the Australian landscape with unsettling beauty, the isolation emphasizing Paris's removal from civilization's oversight. The town itself appears normal: church, hospital, shops, but every institution serves the central economy of controlled crashes. The film's dark humor comes from characters treating monstrous behavior as mundane business practice. The climax delivers automotive carnage as the modified cars rampage through Paris, destroying the town in an orgy of metal and violence. Weir balances satire about capitalist predation with genuine horror about communities that normalize cruelty for profit. The Cars That Ate Paris announced Weir as a major talent before Picnic at Hanging Rock confirmed it. The film's bizarre premise and execution create something uniquely Australian, dark, absurdist, and willing to embrace weirdness completely. Deranged, 1974. In the quiet Midwest, a lonely man named Ezra Cobb lives under the shadow of his domineering mother. When she dies, Ezra cannot let go, literally. He exhumes her corpse and soon begins a grotesque spree of grave robbing and murder, fashioning a macabre world from the remains of the dead. Directed by Alan Ormsby and Jeff Gillen, Deranged is loosely based on the crimes of Ed Gein, the same real-life killer who inspired Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Roberts Blossom delivers a haunting performance as Ezra, capturing both his childlike awkwardness and his descent into monstrous obsession. The film doesn't hold back on its grim details, using stark rural settings and practical effects to build an atmosphere of decay. The makeup, supervised by Tom Savini, is especially unsettling, giving the corpses a disturbingly lifelike presence. Unlike more sensationalized takes on the Gein story, Deranged plays almost like a grim docudrama, with a narrator guiding viewers through Ezra's crimes. This approach gives the film a chilling realism that makes it linger long after the credits roll. Often overshadowed by its more famous counterparts, Deranged remains one of the most disturbing and authentic interpretations of America's most infamous grave robber. Messiah of Evil, 1974. Late one night, a young woman drives up the California coast in search of her missing father, a painter who vanished in a seaside town that seems frozen in time. What she finds there isn't simply isolation. It's a place infected by something ancient, spreading quietly through its people, like a dream that's forgotten upon waking. Messiah of Evil is one of the great forgotten nightmares of the 1970s horror. A surreal, slow-motion descent into madness that feels more like a hallucination than a movie. Written and directed by Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, it channels the detached unease of Carnival of Souls and the doomed coastal atmosphere of The Fog, years before Carpenter made it literal. Everything about the film feels wrong in the best way. The architecture, the silence, the faces that stare too long. Even its most grounded moments seem haunted, as if the town itself is watching. The standout scenes, a supermarket feeding frenzy, a movie theater drenched in red light, are pure cinematic nightmare fuel, burned into the minds of anyone who's seen them. It's quiet, beautiful, and terrifying in equal measure. Messiah of Evil isn't about jump scares or gore. It's about the feeling of being alone somewhere familiar that suddenly doesn't belong to you anymore. Spasmo, 1974. Umberto Lenzi's Spasmo is Italian giallo that starts as playboy thriller and descends into paranoid nightmare where reality itself becomes suspect. Christian encounters a woman on the beach, and their flirtation leads to affair, until he finds her apparently dead. As he investigates, more bodies appear, mannequins positioned at crime scenes complicate evidence, and Christian realizes he can't trust his perception, his memories, or anyone around him. Robert Hoffman plays Christian with appropriate confusion as events spiral beyond comprehension. Susie Kendall brings ambiguity as the woman who may be victim, accomplice, or something else entirely. The supporting cast populates a world where everyone seems to know more than they reveal, keeping Christian and the audience off balance throughout. Lenzi shoots the Italian coastal locations with sun-drenched beauty that contrasts sharply with the mounting paranoia. The mannequins are genuinely unsettling. Lifelike figures positioned to suggest violence, their blank faces and posed bodies creating disorienting crime scenes. The practical gore effects are minimal, but effective when violence erupts, emphasizing psychological horror over exploitation. The film's structure deliberately confuses chronology and perspective, making viewers question what's real versus hallucination or false memory. The giallo elements, mysterious killer, amateur investigation, psychological unraveling, blend with thriller conventions about identity and manipulation. Ennio Morricone's score adds layers of unease, his music shifting between romantic and nightmarish. Spasmo's climax delivers revelation that recontextualizes everything preceding it, forcing viewers to reassess every scene. It's Lenzi working in more cerebral register than his later exploitation work, creating giallo that prioritizes disorientation and mystery over elaborate set-piece violence. The film remains underseen even among giallo completists, representing the subgenre's willingness to experiment with narrative structure and audience expectations. Madhouse, 1974. Jim Clark's Madhouse reunites Vincent Price with Peter Cushing in meta-horror about an actor famous for playing horror villain Dr. Death, who returns to the role after nervous breakdown. When cast and crew begin dying in ways matching Dr. Death's on-screen crimes, suspicion falls on the actor, whose grip on reality seems increasingly fragile. Price plays Paul Toombs with appropriate theatrical flair, a man whose most famous creation might have consumed his identity. He's simultaneously sympathetic, an artist exploited by the industry, and suspect, his mental state deteriorating as bodies accumulate. Cushing provides grounded counterpoint as Toombs' screenwriter friend, playing loyalty and growing concern with characteristic subtlety. The film incorporates actual footage from Price's earlier horror films, blurring the line between his real career and Toombs' fictional one. This meta approach creates unsettling questions about actors who become identified with horror roles and whether performance can contaminate performer. The practical gore effects for the Death's Mirror classic horror imagery, suggesting someone steeped in genre conventions, is orchestrating the violence. Clark keeps the mystery structure functional while allowing Price to explore the psychological toll of being typecast in horror. The behind-the-scenes film industry setting provides variety of potential suspects and victims, while the Dr. Death footage adds genuinely creepy imagery. The revelation of the killer's identity delivers both narrative satisfaction and comment on exploitation and obsession. Madhouse arrived near the end of Price's peak horror period, offering surprisingly thoughtful examination of the cost of horror stardom. It's minor work in both stars' filmographies, but benefits from their professionalism and the self-aware premise. The film asks uncomfortable questions about the relationship between performer and role, reality and performance, without providing easy answers. Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter, 1974. Hammer Films attempted to launch a new franchise with Brian Clemens's Captain Kronos. Kronos travels the countryside with his hunchbacked assistant, Professor Grost, hunting vampires using knowledge accumulated across cultures and centuries. When a village reports young women aging to death overnight, They investigate a local aristocratic family whose members might be draining youth rather than blood. Horst Janssen plays Kronos with athletic charisma, treating vampire hunting as noble profession, requiring both swordplay and scientific methodology. John Cater brings dark humor as Grost, the scholar who understands that vampire rules vary by region and bloodline. Caroline Munro provides both romantic interest and capable partnership, refusing to be simple damsel. The film's approach to vampire lore is refreshingly flexible. Kronos and Grost test various methods to determine what works on these particular creatures, acknowledging that crosses, stakes, and garlic aren't universal solutions. The sword-fighting sequences are impressively choreographed for Hammer production, with Kronos dispatching both human and undead opponents with swashbuckling flair. The vampire attacks drain youth and vitality rather than blood, creating victims aged decades in moments through effective makeup work. The aristocratic villains operate with entitled menace, treating peasants as renewable resources for their immortality. Clemens directs with energy and wit, clearly intending to establish Kronos as ongoing hero. The film blends genres confidently: Gothic horror, adventure serial, mystery, creating something that feels both fresh and respectfully traditional. The period setting and practical effects give everything tactile quality, despite obvious budget constraints. Captain Kronos was designed as franchise starter, but Hammer's financial troubles prevented sequels. It remains a cult favorite for its inventive approach to vampire mythology, an action-oriented hero who treats supernatural threats as solvable problems, requiring proper tools and knowledge. It's Alive, 1974. Larry Cohen's It's Alive is monster movie as family horror, exploring parental responsibility when your newborn is a fanged, clawed creature that slaughters the delivery room staff. Frank and Lenore Davies' long-awaited second child is born grotesquely mutated and immediately violent, escaping the hospital to hunt while authorities mobilize and the parents grapple with whether their child is monster or victim of circumstance beyond its control. John P. Ryan delivers a powerhouse performance as Frank, a father torn between instinct to protect his offspring and horror at what it's done. Sharon Farrell plays Lenore with maternal devotion that refuses to accept her baby as simple monster, even as evidence mounts of its violence. Cohen treats their emotional journey with surprising seriousness, understanding that the creature represents every parent's fear of their child being wrong in ways they can't fix. Rick Baker designed the creature, kept largely obscured through shadows and brief glimpses. The practical effects for its attacks are brutal, but Cohen wisely limits full reveals. Understanding suggestion creates more effective dread. The film operates as metaphor for parental anxiety, environmental pollution causing mutations, and society's response to difference. Cohen asks uncomfortable questions about when offspring becomes other and whether monstrosity erases parental obligation. The creature's violence is instinctive rather than malicious, complicating simple monster movie resolution. It's Alive spawned 2 sequels and a remake, but the original remains Cohen's most emotionally complex work. It's exploitation cinema with genuine heart, understanding that the scariest monsters are the ones you're supposed to love unconditionally. Vampires, 1974. José Ramón Larraz's Vampires is British vampire eroticism that prioritizes atmosphere and sensuality over traditional narrative. 2 female vampires lure male travelers to their Gothic mansion, seducing and slowly draining them over days. A camper parked nearby witnesses strange occurrences and investigates, discovering the mansion's deadly inhabitants and their nocturnal hunts. Marianne Morris and Anulka Dzubinska play the vampires with genuine chemistry and predatory grace, their relationship both romantic and dangerous. The film treats their sexuality explicitly, using eroticism as weapon and genuine connection simultaneously. The victims arrive seeking adventure and find themselves imprisoned in pleasure that's literally draining their lives. Larraz shoots the British countryside and Gothic mansion with lush beauty, creating genuinely atmospheric horror. The practical blood effects are lavish. The vampires feed messily, their victims covered in wounds that accumulate over extended stays. The mansion becomes prison disguised as pleasure palace, its beauty concealing the fact that no guest leaves alive. The film's approach to vampire mythology is ambiguous. Are they supernatural creatures, or simply disturbed women who believe they're vampires? The ambiguity enhances rather than diminishes the horror, making their behavior more unsettling. The extended seduction and feeding sequences emphasize the victim's complicity in their own destruction. Vampires arrived during British horror's decline, but represents the era's willingness to blend eroticism with genuine Gothic atmosphere. It's more explicit than Hammer ever attempted, while maintaining similar commitment to mood and setting. The film found cult status through repertory screenings and home video, where audiences appreciated its patient atmosphere and unapologetic sensuality. It remains one of the most purely atmospheric vampire films of the 70s, prioritizing mood and eroticism over plot mechanics or elaborate mythology. Dead of Night, 1974. Bob Clark's Dead of Night, also known as Death Dream, reimagines The Monkey's Paw through Vietnam War trauma. Andy Brooks dies in combat, devastating his family. When he returns home days later claiming he's fine, his mother's joy blinds her to the truth. Her son came back wrong, requiring fresh blood to maintain his reanimation and growing increasingly violent as his body decays. Richard Backus plays Andy with haunting detachment, portraying a young man who's physically present but spiritually absent. He moves with stiff mechanical precision, his thousand-yard stare suggesting he's seen things that killed who he was even if his body still functions. Lynn Carlin delivers heartbreaking performance as the mother whose desperate need for her son's return makes her complicit in his crimes. John Marley plays the father who recognizes the truth his wife refuses to accept. Tom Savini's early makeup effects work shows Andy's gradual decomposition. Graying skin, sunken eyes, physical deterioration that makeup can't fully hide. The practical gore effects for Andy's victims are impressively brutal, particularly a nightmare-inducing syringe sequence. Clark shoots Andy's nocturnal hunts with genuine dread, emphasizing his predatory transformation. The film works as both horror and anti-war statement, treating Andy's condition as metaphor for PTSD and the impossibility of returning unchanged from combat. The family's attempts to maintain normalcy while their son literally rots become unbearably tragic. Clark refuses easy catharsis, understanding that some damage can't be healed. Dead of Night remains one of the most effective zombie films ever made, using supernatural premise to explore very real trauma. It's nasty, sad, and uncompromising, proof that exploitation cinema could deliver both visceral horror and genuine emotional devastation. Lips of Blood, 1975. A man at a promotional event glimpses a photograph of a mysterious castle and becomes obsessed with recovering a buried childhood memory connected to the ruins. His search leads him to a beautiful young woman he believes he met years ago, a quest that awakens a coven of female vampires and forces him to confront a past his family tried desperately to erase. Directed by Jean Rollin, Lips of Blood is pure dream state vampire cinema, a film that moves with the logic of memory and desire rather than traditional narrative structure. Rollin, a French auteur known for his poetic approach to horror, crafts a love story wrapped in Gothic atmosphere and erotic melancholy. This is vampire cinema at its most romantic and mournful, where death and love are indistinguishable. Jean-Louis Philippe plays Frédéric with genuine vulnerability, portraying obsession not as madness, but as an almost spiritual calling. Annie Bell is ethereal as the vampire Jennifer, appearing and disappearing like a half-remembered dream given form. The supporting cast of female vampires moves through nighttime Paris like ghosts, their presence more sad than threatening. Rollin shoots Paris at night with remarkable beauty. Empty streets, ancient cemeteries, and crumbling ruins bathed in blue moonlight. The film has an improvised, almost accidental quality that somehow enhances its atmosphere. The budget was minimal, the locations were often borrowed or stolen, but these limitations force creativity that gives the film its unique texture. There's barely any violence, little traditional horror, just longing, memory, and the ache of trying to return to something lost. Lips of Blood won't satisfy anyone looking for conventional scares, but for those willing to surrender to its melancholic rhythm, it's hypnotic. Autopsy, 1975. A young pathologist in Rome begins experiencing disturbing hallucinations as she examines the bodies of apparent suicide victims during a citywide heatwave that seems to be driving the population toward madness. As the line between her professional life and psychological breakdown blurs, she uncovers a conspiracy that suggests these deaths might not be self-inflicted after all. Directed by Armando Crispino, Autopsy, also known as The Victim, is Italian giallo, filtered through forensic horror and existential dread. The film trades the genre's typical masked killer theatrics for something more unsettling. A deep dive into death itself, both literal and psychological. Crispino fills the screen with clinical autopsy footage, paranoid dream sequences, and a Rome that feels like it's slowly cooking under the oppressive heat. Mimsy Farmer delivers a compelling performance as the increasingly unraveled protagonist, playing fragility and determination with equal conviction. Her character exists in a constant state of uncertainty, questioning her sanity, her memories, and the motives of everyone around her. Barry Primus and Ray Lovelock round out a cast that operates in morally gray territory where trust is a luxury no one can afford. The film's visual approach is striking. Crispino juxtaposes sterile morgue environments with hallucinatory sequences that feel like fever dreams. Ennio Morricone's score oscillates between discordant tension and melancholic beauty, adding layers of unease to scenes that already feel off-kilter. The autopsy sequences themselves are genuinely disturbing, shot with documentary-like detachment that makes them all the more uncomfortable. Autopsy never quite became a giallo classic like its contemporaries, but it offers something rarer, a meditation on death, guilt, and societal collapse wrapped in genre clothing. The Amusement Park, 1975. An elderly man navigates a nightmarish amusement park where every attraction becomes a metaphor for the indignities, violence, and institutional cruelty inflicted upon the elderly in American society. What appears to be a simple day at the park transforms into a surreal journey through dehumanization, neglect, and systematic abuse. Directed by George A. Romero and commissioned by the Lutheran Service Society as an educational film about ageism, The Amusement Park is one of the most disturbing films ever made, and it was deemed too intense to be shown upon completion, remaining unreleased for decades. Romero takes the framework of a PSA and transforms it into psychological horror that's more unsettling than any zombie film he ever made. Lincoln Mazel, a non-professional actor, plays the elderly protagonist with heartbreaking vulnerability. He moves through the park's attractions, each one revealing another form of elder abuse, from financial exploitation to medical neglect to outright physical violence, with increasing confusion and despair. The performance is raw and genuine, making every humiliation land with uncomfortable force. Romero shoots the amusement park as a fever dream, using disorienting angles, harsh lighting, and overlapping sound design to create sensory overload. The attractions become increasingly nightmarish. A bumper car sequence turns into vehicular assault. A fortune teller delivers crushing mortality statistics. A motorcycle gang physically attacks the elderly for sport. Nothing is subtle. Everything is deliberately excessive. But the exaggeration reveals uncomfortable truths. The film's relentless bleakness and uncompromising vision made it unsaleable as educational material. But as horror cinema, it's devastatingly effective. The amusement park proves that real horror doesn't need supernatural elements, just an honest look at how society treats its most vulnerable. Footprints on the Moon, 1975. A translator wakes up with no memory of the past 3 days, plagued by fragments of a disturbing science fiction film she can't remember watching. Following cryptic clues and half-remembered images, she travels to a desolate coastal town where the residents seem to know her. But she has no recollection of ever being there before. Directed by Luigi Bazzoni and co-written by Mario Finelli, Footprints on the Moon, original title Le Orme, is one of Italian cinema's most haunting psychological mysteries, a film that operates more like a waking nightmare, where nothing is quite reliable and every answer leads to more unsettling questions. Florinda Bolkan gives a mesmerizing performance as Alice, embodying confusion and dread with quiet intensity. She moves through the film like someone trying to wake from a dream they're not sure is theirs, constantly off balance in environments that should be familiar but feel fundamentally wrong. Klaus Kinski appears in brief but unforgettable sequences from the fictional film within a film, playing an astronaut abandoned on the moon, imagery that mirrors Alice's own isolation and abandonment. Cinematographer Vittorio Storaro bathes everything in amber light and deep shadows, creating a sun-bleached Mediterranean setting. The film refuses easy explanations, embracing ambiguity and dream logic in ways that frustrated some audiences but captivated others. It's horror as existential mystery, less interested in monsters than in the terror of losing yourself completely. The Premonition, 1976. A young girl is abducted by her mentally unstable birth mother and a psychic clown, triggering a desperate search by her adoptive parents. As the investigation unfolds, the adoptive mother begins experiencing terrifying psychic visions that may be the only way to find her daughter before it's too late, but the visions themselves threaten her sanity. Directed by Robert Alan Schnitzer, The Premonition is regional horror cinema at its most ambitious, a film that tackles psychic terror, parental anxiety, and carnival grotesquerie with genuine emotional investment, despite obvious budget constraints. Shot in Mississippi with largely local talent, the film has a raw, unpolished quality that actually enhances its unsettling atmosphere. Sharon Farrell plays the adoptive mother with escalating desperation, selling the psychic visions with committed intensity. The sequences where she experiences flashes of her daughter's location are genuinely disorienting, using optical effects and sound design to create a sense of consciousness fragmenting under stress. Richard Lynch, always reliable as an unsettling presence, appears in a supporting role that adds menace to the proceedings. The film's most distinctive element is its villain, a mime-slash-clown character whose silence and white-face paint make him genuinely eerie rather than campy. The carnival setting provides appropriately liminal spaces for horror, empty fairgrounds, abandoned rides, and spaces designed for joy turned threatening. Schnitzer wrings atmosphere from these locations, understanding that familiar spaces made wrong are inherently frightening. The Premonition never quite reaches the heights it's reaching for, but there's real ambition and heart in the attempt. It's the kind of regional independent horror that proves passion can compensate for limited resources, delivering genuine chills despite its rough edges. Satanico Pandemonium, 1975. A young nun begins experiencing intense visions of violence and temptation after a mysterious encounter in the convent garden. As demonic forces invade her every thought, she descends into sin, blasphemy, and acts of violence, unable to distinguish between hallucination and reality, as Satan himself seems determined to claim her soul. Directed by Gilberto Martinez Solares, Satanico Pandemonium is Mexican nunsploitation at its most unhinged, a film that blends Catholic guilt, psychological horror, and surreal imagery into something that feels genuinely transgressive, even by exploitation standards. The film doesn't shy away from its provocative premise, delivering a parade of blasphemous imagery and forbidden desires while maintaining an oddly serious tone. Cecilia Pazé plays Sister Maria with remarkable commitment, navigating the character's psychological unraveling with genuine intensity. Her performance grounds the film's more outrageous moments, making the descent feel tragic, rather than purely exploitative. Enrique Rocha appears as the demonic tempter, equal parts seductive and sadistic, pushing Maria toward increasingly horrific acts. The film's visual approach leans heavily into religious iconography turned profane, crucifixes, sacred spaces, and devotional rituals transformed into sites of corruption. The hallucination sequences are lurid and dreamlike, shot with garish colors and distorted compositions that emphasize Maria's fractured mental state. The Mexican locations provide appropriately Gothic backdrops, ancient convents and desolate landscapes that feel removed from time. Satanico Pandemonium walks a difficult line between exploitation and examination of religious repression, never quite settling on one or the other. It's simultaneously exploitative and genuinely interested in the psychological damage of extreme devotion and denied desire. The result is uncomfortable, excessive, and undeniably memorable. Race with the Devil, 1975. Two couples on a recreational RV trip through rural Texas witness a satanic sacrifice in a remote field. When they report what they saw, the local authorities dismiss their claims. But the cultists have no intention of letting witnesses escape. What begins as a vacation quickly becomes a high-speed chase through the Southwest, with devil worshippers closing in from every direction. Directed by Jack Starrett, Race with the Devil is one of the most effective occult thrillers of the 70s, a film that weaponizes American paranoia about rural outsiders and combines it with action movie pacing. The genius of the premise is its simplicity. Nowhere is safe. Anyone could be involved, and the hero's best asset is their mobility, which becomes increasingly meaningless. As the conspiracy expands, Peter Fonda and Warren Oates anchor the film, with easy camaraderie and mounting desperation. They're not action heroes or investigators, just regular guys who made the mistake of seeing something they shouldn't have. Loretta Swit and Lara Parker complete the quartet, playing capable partners rather than screaming victims. The group dynamic feels authentic. Their banter grounding the escalating supernatural threats. The cultists are genuinely menacing. Not theatrical Satanists, but everyday people who could be gas station attendants, mechanics, or local sheriffs. The film's paranoia comes from this ordinariness. The creeping realization that the conspiracy might be everywhere. The climax delivers one of horror's more nihilistic endings, refusing to provide easy resolution or safety. Race with the Devil taps into deep American anxieties about the unknown spaces between cities and what might be happening there, and it does so with relentless efficiency. Psychic Killer, 1975. A man wrongfully imprisoned for his mother's murder is released when new evidence proves his innocence, but his time behind bars has awakened latent psychic abilities. Using astral projection and telekinetic powers, he begins systematically murdering those responsible for his false conviction, leaving authorities baffled by deaths that seem to occur with no physical perpetrator present. Directed by Ray Danton, Psychic Killer is a supernatural revenge thriller that plays like a dark mirror to Death Wish, replacing Charles Bronson's vigilante justice with paranormal vengeance. The film takes its pulpy premise seriously enough to generate genuine tension, while embracing the B-movie absurdity of death by psychic powers. Jim Hutton plays the wronged protagonist, with quiet intensity that makes his turn toward vengeance feel earned rather than exploitative. He's not a cackling villain, but a broken man using newly discovered abilities to balance scales that were never fair to begin with. Paul Burke and Julie Adams play investigators trying to solve murders that defy physical explanation, bringing credibility to increasingly bizarre crime scenes. The kill sequences are inventive and often darkly humorous. Victims die in ways that appear accidental or impossible, leaving authorities with no suspects and no logical explanations. Danton stages these deaths with playful creativity, understanding that part of the film's appeal is watching karma delivered through supernatural means. The special effects are modest, but effective, selling the psychic projection concept without overreaching the budget. Beneath the exploitation surface, the film actually grapples with questions of justice and revenge, whether supernatural abilities justify vigilante action, and at what point justified anger becomes something darker. Psychic Killer doesn't dig too deep, but it acknowledges these themes exist, giving the pulp premise surprising substance. Night of the Seagulls, 1975. A young doctor and his wife arrive in a remote coastal village to take over the local medical practice, only to discover the community harbors a dark secret. Every 7 years, the villagers sacrifice young women to ancient creatures that emerge at night, drawn by tolling bells and centuries-old rituals that no one dares break. Directed by Armando de Osorio, Night of the Seagulls is the fourth and final entry in the Blind Dead series. What it lacks in the iconic imagery of the earlier films, it compensates with a pervasive sense of dread and a community horror setup that predates the Wicker Man's influence on the genre. Victor Petit and Maria Costi play the outsider couple with appropriate bewilderment and mounting horror as they realize the village's true nature. The locals, bound by fear and tradition, are portrayed not as villains, but as victims of a curse they're too terrified to challenge. This moral complexity gives the film unexpected weight. These aren't evil cultists, just desperate people making terrible choices. De Osorio builds tension through atmosphere rather than action. Fog-shrouded beaches, crashing waves, and the ominous sound of bells cutting through the night. The creatures themselves are effectively grotesque creations that feel genuinely ancient and malevolent. The ritualistic sacrifice scenes are staged with Gothic formality, emphasizing ceremony over exploitation. The film serves as a somber conclusion to the Blind Dead saga, ending the series on a quieter, more fatalistic note. It's less about spectacle and more about inevitability, the weight of history and how some evils become so entrenched that breaking them seems impossible. The Ghoul, 1975. This 1975 chiller from Tyburn Film Productions leans heavily into classic Gothic imagery. Decaying mansions, repressed secrets, and a dark presence that never quite shows itself until it's too late. Directed by Freddie Francis, known for his work with Hammer and Amicus, The Ghoul reunites Peter Cushing with that familiar world of creaking staircases and candlelit dread. At its core, it's a story of curiosity gone fatally wrong. A group of friends, lost after a car race through the English countryside, stumble upon an isolated estate belonging to a former clergyman haunted by his past. What waits inside is a disturbing secret hidden behind locked doors and within the decaying heart of the house, a secret that connects directly to his guilt and grief. Cushing, as always, gives the material emotional weight, playing a man torn between faith and madness. The movie feels like a time capsule of the fading Gothic horror era, arriving just as British studios were losing ground to the more visceral shocks of American cinema. But its gloomy tone, ornate visuals, and tragic performances make it an intriguing farewell to that classic style. The Ghoul stands as both a love letter and a eulogy, the echo of Hammer's haunted corridors still lingering one last time before the lights went out. Massacre at Central High, 1976. High school becomes a war zone in this sharp, subversive cult thriller that turns teenage angst into political allegory. When a new student transfers to Central High, he finds a campus ruled by a trio of bullies who control the halls through intimidation. But when he finally strikes back, the social order collapses. And what replaces it is even more disturbing. Part revenge film, part moral fable, Massacre at Central High takes the familiar teen drama and twists it into something brutal and intelligent. Director René Dalder strips away adult authority entirely, leaving the students to form their own twisted hierarchy. What starts as rebellion quickly turns into a study of corruption and the cycle of power, a clever reflection of how easily victims can become oppressors. The film's low-budget production only enhances its stark, almost dreamlike tone. There's no music blasting or flashy editing, just quiet tension, empty hallways, and an atmosphere of inevitable collapse. It's the kind of movie that snuck into midnight programming and stuck with anyone who stumbled across it. Long before Heathers or Battle Royale, this film was already exploring how peer pressure and revenge can curdle into something apocalyptic. Massacre at Central High might wear the look of a simple exploitation flick, but beneath the surface, it's one of the most cynical and thought-provoking teen horror stories of its era. Who Can Kill a Child? 1976. A quiet vacation turns into something unspeakable in this deeply unsettling Spanish horror gem. A British couple travels to a remote island off the coast of Spain, searching for sun and peace before the arrival of their third child. But what greets them isn't paradise. It's a town frozen in silence. The shops are empty, the doors stand open, and the only inhabitants left are the children, smiling with an eerie calm that grows more sinister by the minute. Director Narciso Ibáñez Serrador transforms the idyllic setting into something nightmarish, using bright sunlight and open spaces to heighten the unease. There's no darkness to hide in here. Every scene feels exposed, and that's what makes it terrifying. The horror builds slowly, more psychological than visceral, as the couple realizes the true nature of the island's nightmare. It's a story about guilt, human cruelty, and the terrifying idea that innocence can become its own form of violence. Few films from the 1970s feel this morally charged or confident in tone. Serrador weaves tension like a documentary of decay, capturing something primal and unforgettable. Long after it ends, the question in its title continues to echo. Not as a challenge, but as a haunting reminder of what people become when reason gives way to fear. The Food of the Gods, 1976. Nature fights back in this gloriously chaotic slice of 1970s eco-horror, where science meddles with evolution and pays the price. Deep in the wilderness of British Columbia, a mysterious milky substance bubbles up from the earth. When animals feed on it, they grow. Not just large, but monstrously oversized. Soon, rats the size of wolves and wasps with wingspans like eagles are turning the quiet countryside into a war zone. Loosely inspired by H.G. Wells's novel, The Food of the Gods delivers everything one could hope for from drive-in creature cinema: miniature sets, rubbery effects, and sheer enthusiasm. Director Burt I. Gordon, known to fans as Mr. B.I.G., stages the chaos with endearing earnestness, filling every frame with practical ingenuity and old-fashioned spectacle. The giant animal attacks may look dated now, but their handmade quality gives the film a strange, enduring charm. Marjoe Gortner leads the cast with straight-faced seriousness that only makes the madness more entertaining. What makes the movie fun is its total lack of cynicism. It believes in its premise completely. Behind the pulpy thrills, there's even a faint ecological warning, a sense that nature's revenge might be well earned. It's messy, loud, and completely unrestrained, the kind of film that defined weekend rentals and late-night marathons. The Food of the Gods may not be elegant, but it's a perfect time capsule of 1970s creature feature excess, where every swarm, squeal, and explosion feels like the end of the world. The House with Laughing Windows, 1976. In a small Italian village surrounded by swamps and silence, a restorer is hired to uncover a church fresco painted by a long-dead artist known for disturbing imagery. As he begins his work, whispers spread through the town, stories of madness, murder, and the painter's obsession with capturing real suffering. The further he digs into the art, the more he realizes that the horror behind it never truly ended. Pupi Avati's The House with Laughing Windows is one of the great slow-burn mysteries of Italian horror, a film steeped in dread rather than spectacle. Instead of giallo-style excess or flashy violence, it builds unease through atmosphere. Decaying buildings, strange villagers, and the constant hum of something unseen. The beauty of the Italian countryside becomes a trap, its warmth concealing rot beneath the surface. Avati directs with painterly precision, blending mystery, folklore, and psychological terror into a seamless whole. Every clue feels cursed, every smile conceals something sinister. By the time the truth is revealed, the viewer feels as trapped as the protagonist. Surrounded by darkness, hiding in plain sight. Unearthed by horror fans decades later, The House with Laughing Windows has earned its place as a masterpiece of mood and suggestion. Proof that true fear doesn't need spectacle, only silence and time to take root. Squirm, 1976. When a brutal storm knocks down power lines in the backwoods of Georgia, something sinister awakens beneath the mud. Thousands of electrified worms rise to the surface, swarming through homes, trees, and bodies, with an appetite that can't be stopped. At first, it's just a strange local curiosity, until the ground itself begins to move. Director Jeff Lieberman brings a raw, grimy authenticity to this creature feature, grounding its absurd premise with an eerie southern atmosphere. The rural setting feels sticky and claustrophobic, and the cast of small-town characters, from the visiting outsider to the suspicious locals, gives the story a lived-in realism. What sets Squirm apart from other nature-gone-wild horror of the era is its texture, the sound of rainfall against tin roofs, the close-ups of writhing movement, the sense that nature itself is reclaiming what humanity has spoiled. While some moments veer toward camp, the film's handmade effects and creeping dread create an unease that's hard to shake. It's the kind of movie that would have played late on a Friday night, something you stumble onto halfway through, unable to look away, even as the horror gets stranger by the minute. Dirty, loud, and crawling with energy, Squirm is pure 1970s drive-in mayhem. The kind that sticks to your skin long after the credits roll. Dark August, 1976. A quiet Vermont town becomes the stage for paranoia and witchcraft in this overlooked American folk horror gem. After accidentally killing a young girl in a car accident, a man retreats to the countryside to escape the guilt. But peace never comes. Strange figures appear in the woods, animals react to something unseen, and whispers suggest that the girl's grandfather, a local hermit, has cursed him. What begins as grief and isolation slowly transforms into supernatural terror. Dark August thrives on atmosphere rather than spectacle. The rural landscapes, captured in washed-out tones, feel alive with something hidden just beyond sight. Director Martin Goldman keeps the pacing deliberate, allowing each uneasy moment to build upon the last. There's no grand revelation or chaotic climax, just a steady tightening of dread as reality and superstition intertwine. The performances have a naturalistic quality that makes the film's descent into occult fear all the more convincing. J.J. Barrie's portrayal of a man unraveling under unseen forces is quietly desperate, while Kim Hunter brings a grounding presence as a local psychic who might be his only hope. Though it never gained the recognition of its British folk horror counterparts, Dark August captures the same haunting stillness. The sense that nature itself has turned judgmental. It's a slow, eerie dream of guilt and punishment, the kind of film that lingers like smoke long after the credits fade. Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1976. In the smoky back alleys of New York's underground theater scene, a demented stage director puts on performances that blur the line between illusion and atrocity. To the shocked patrons, it looks like extreme art, a grotesque display of pain and spectacle. But behind the curtains, the show is terrifyingly real. Also known as Sardu Master of the Screaming Virgins and The Incredible Torture Show, Blood-Sucking Freaks is one of the most infamous exploitation films of the 1970s, a collision of sadistic humor and underground grit that still manages to shock decades later. Directed by Joel M. Reed, it's less a traditional horror story and more a descent into the sleaziest corners of grindhouse cinema, where morality doesn't exist and the audience itself becomes complicit. It's a movie designed to provoke, and it does so with a grimy, unapologetic tone that could only have come from the heyday of Times Square's exploitation theaters. The low-budget production only adds to its impact. Every flicker of bad lighting and scratch of film grain feels like part of the experience. It's the kind of movie whispered about among collectors and banned lists, something that survived on bootlegs and late-night rentals, infamous for good reason. Not for the faint of heart, Blood-Sucking Freaks stands as a wild time capsule of 1970s transgression, a reminder of when horror pushed boundaries not for prestige, but for pure shock value. It's grotesque, absurd, and unforgettable in ways only that era could deliver. Death Weekend, 1976. A quiet weekend retreat turns savage in this tense and grim piece of Canadian horror. A wealthy dentist and his sharp-witted girlfriend drive to a secluded lakeside home for a getaway, but a group of reckless men follows them there after a road altercation. What begins as taunting quickly erupts into violence, trapping the couple in a nightmare of survival as civility crumbles. and revenge becomes the only language left. Directed by William Fruit and produced by Ivan Reitman before his comedy fame, Death Weekend, also released as The House by the Lake, is raw and unnerving, less about gore and more about the steady, escalating cruelty people are capable of when rules disappear. Brenda Vaccaro gives a commanding performance as the woman forced to fight back. Not a screaming victim, but someone pushed to her limits and beyond. The isolated setting, the eerily quiet lake, and the emptiness of the surrounding woods all combine into a suffocating atmosphere of dread. What separates this from the exploitation crowd is its restraint. Fruit doesn't glorify the violence. He lets it hang in the air, making every scream and sound of breaking glass feel earned. The result is a revenge story that's cold, uncomfortable, and far more human than it first appears. Death Weekend may not be widely remembered, but for those who saw it on late-night TV or stumbled across the tape years later, it remains one of Canada's most brutal and overlooked thrillers. Embryo, 1976. Science meets moral collapse in this cerebral slice of 1970s sci-fi horror. A brilliant geneticist, played by Rock Hudson, becomes obsessed with unlocking the secrets of accelerated human growth. His experiments begin with animals, but when he successfully grows a human embryo into an adult woman in a matter of weeks, his fascination turns to obsession, and the lines between creation, control, and conscience begin to blur. Embryo unfolds like a cautionary parable about ambition gone too far. Director Ralph Nelson treats the subject with a cold precision, more medical thriller than monster movie. Yet the unease builds quietly under every sterile lab light. Barbara Carrera brings a haunting mix of vulnerability and intelligence to the role of the rapidly maturing woman, creating a tragic counterpoint to Hudson's performance as a man seduced by his own intellect. While its pacing feels methodical, the film's ideas linger, questioning not only the ethics of science, but the fragility of empathy itself. It's part Frankenstein, part Twilight Zone, and entirely of its era, reflecting the growing anxiety over technological advancement and the loss of human restraint. For audiences who discovered it through faded rentals or late-night broadcasts, Embryo stood out as something different. A slow, unsettling experiment in psychological horror that leaves its biggest questions deliberately unanswered. To the Devil a Daughter, 1976. In the waning days of Hammer's horror reign, this dark and atmospheric tale arrived like a final incantation. Based on the novel by Dennis Wheatley, the story follows an excommunicated priest who raises a young girl for sinister purposes. A vessel meant to bring something unspeakable into the world. When an American occult author uncovers the plan, a desperate struggle between faith and darkness begins. Hammer Films had built its legacy on Gothic castles and Victorian monsters, but To the Devil a Daughter shifts the terror into modern times, neon-lit London streets and sunlit exteriors replacing fog and candlelight. Christopher Lee is chilling as the fallen priest, his calm voice concealing pure devotion to evil, while a young Nastasia Kinski gives the film a haunting innocence that makes every scene more unsettling. Director Peter Sykes blends occult mystery with psychological tension, leaning into the paranoia and moral decay of the 1970s. The result is an eerie, elegant descent into corruption and faith, tested to its breaking point. It's a slow burn filled with religious dread and quiet menace, not Hammer's loudest scream, but one of its most mature and unnerving. Released just as the studio's Gothic empire was crumbling, To the Devil a Daughter feels like the last gasp of a dying era, a sophisticated, sinister curtain call that left audiences wondering what new horrors the next decade would bring. Day of the Animals, 1977. High in the mountains, a group of hikers signs up for fresh air and weekend adventure, only to find the wilderness no longer playing by the rules. With the ozone thinning overhead and tempers fraying on the trail, nature starts pushing back, patient, relentless, and everywhere at once. The setup is lean, a mixed bag of personalities, a guide who's seen too much, and a storm front of bad decisions. When the first attack hits, it feels like a fluke. When the second comes, It feels like a pattern. Soon it's clear. Predators and prey have swapped places, and the forest is calling the shots. The suspense comes from distance closing. The way quiet tree lines turn into eyes, the way a clearing stops feeling safe, the way night brings the soundscapes right up to your ear. Performances lean into survival tension. Fragile egos, stubborn pride, flashes of bravery that arrive a step too late. The filmmaking favors real locations and the unpredictability of animals, trading slick choreography for a rough, immersive texture. You feel wind, rain, and altitude in the framing. By the time the group is whittled down to desperate choices, the movie has made its case. When the balance tips, it tips fast. It's man versus nature done with blunt force, a rugged slice of 70s eco-horror where the trail map won't help, and the ridgeline is just another line you can't hold. The Uncanny, 1977. A horror author insists cats are the real villains of history, and he's got stories to prove it. Three tales unfold, different eras, different houses, the same soft-footed menace, before the framing present catches up with him in ways he probably should have expected. This is an anthology in cozy cruel mode, fireplaces, parlors, and claws. Each segment gives the cats a new angle, silent witnesses to greed, instruments of revenge, or something older and stranger. The fun is in the tonal shift from genteel to nasty, watching respectable rooms turn hostile, one paw step at a time. Performances are arch and enjoyable, with actors leaning into the macabre, bedtime story vibe. Practical animal work and careful staging keep the set pieces playful and eerie, rather than outrageous. The direction treats cats not as jump scares, but as presences, appearing in doorways, on banisters, always looking, always waiting. Its charm lies in commitment, taking a premise that sounds whimsical and playing it straight enough to unsettle. By the final tag, you'll be side-eyeing the nearest pair of green eyes and wondering who's keeping secrets about whom. 9 Guests for a Crime, 1977. A wealthy family retreat to a private island to celebrate, reconcile, and quietly settle old scores. The tide rises, the boat leaves, and the smiles turn brittle. When the first guest goes missing, everyone discovers the worst part about a luxury getaway. There's nowhere to go. This is the elegant, poison champagne side of 70s thrillers, sunlit coves, white linen, and resentments that date back decades. The film uses the island like a stage, every terrace a trap, every corridor a confession booth. Motives pile up as secrets spill, inheritance disputes, romantic histories, and the kind of grudges money can't bury. The cast leans into suspicion with sharp glances and clipped lines. No one is quite innocent, and that's the fun. Direction favors clean compositions and measured reveals, more cat and mouse than splatter. Each disappearance recalibrates the puzzle until the guest list has more questions than names. It functions both as a whodunit and a morality play about wealth, entitlement, and the reckoning that waits offshore. By the time the truth surfaces, it feels both inevitable and nasty, a final reminder that, on a small island, the past has perfect aim. Prey, 1977. They arrive in the English countryside like a rumor, a couple living in isolation, and a strange man who appears at their door with a story that doesn't hold together. He's polite, he's curious, and he isn't from around here. What starts as awkward hospitality slides into a test of power, desire, and survival. The film is intimate, almost stage-bound, turning a house and its grounds into a pressure cooker. Meals, cigarettes, glances through curtains, every small gesture matters. The visitor studies human behavior with the cool patience of a biologist. The couple studies him right back, unsure if he's prey, predator, or both. The tension is erotic and ominous, with bursts of dark humor that make the next silence feel twice as loud. Performances are prickly and fearless, shifting alliances scene by scene. The direction lets quiet rooms breathe while the score pricks at the edges. When violence comes, it's not a set piece so much as a consequence, something that grows out of character rather than crashing in from outside. It's sci-fi horror in a tailored jacket. Small, strange, and memorable, the sort of film that burrows under your skin with ideas first, blood second. When the visitor's true nature is revealed, it reframes everything you've seen and makes the last look out over the fields feel chillingly final. Shockwaves, 1977. Paradise curdles fast when a tour boat runs aground near a decaying resort. The caretaker warns them to leave. The ocean goes unnaturally still. And then the figures appear, rising from the water in formation, goggle-eyed and silent, as if the sea itself is returning the past to shore. This is aquatic horror by way of war ghosts, disciplined, relentless, and eerily quiet. The movie trades jump scares for procession. Those slow, implacable marches through surf and mangrove, always closing distance, never hurrying. Sunlight is no protection here. The brightness only makes the shapes clearer. Performances sell the panic as options dwindle. Engines fail, radios die, and every path seems to lead back to the waterline. The cinematography builds a suffocating calm, lingering on horizon lines, and the mechanical precision of the stalkers. Sound design matters. No roar, just the slap of waves and the grind of old metal. Its lasting power is simple, an image you can't forget. The idea that something disciplined and dead has found you and will not stop. By the final act, escape feels like a math problem with no solution, just a countdown you hear in your own pulse. The Sentinel, 1977, an apartment in a beautiful brownstone, becomes the gateway to a different kind of neighborly. A model looking for a quiet life signs the lease. Soon, upstairs, parties get strange, the building's history leaks through the walls, and the kindly priest down the hall seems to be guarding something more than his privacy. This is urban Gothic, sun-through-lace curtains, old wood that creaks like it remembers, and a cast of tenants who don't add up. The film works in layers, seduction, then discomfort, then outright dread as the building reveals its true job. The city outside is lively and indifferent. Inside, time gets sticky, and the rules change. Performances capture the pull between glamour and decay, innocence and initiation. The camera lingers on corridors and staircases, as if the architecture itself is exerting pressure. Religious imagery threads through in ways that feel both classical and transgressive, pushing the story toward a confrontation that's less battle than acceptance of a role no one would choose. By the end, the apartment is less a place than a position. The film leaves you with the unsettling thought that some guardians don't retire. They're chosen, seated, and expected to watch forever. The Chosen, also known as Holocaust 2000, 1977, power plants promise progress, until an industrialist learns his global project might be the blueprint for something apocalyptic. Each new accident feels less like chance and more like design. Prophecies start lining up with modern headlines, and a father begins to wonder if the heir to his empire is destined for something far darker. This is slick, international, occult thriller territory. Jets, boardrooms, desert construction sites, and cathedrals full of warnings he'd rather ignore. The tension comes from confidence cracking. Watching a man who thinks he controls everything realize he may be a piece on someone else's board. The film balances political intrigue with supernatural dread, letting symbols and coincidences stack until denial is no longer possible. Performances carry that corporate gravitas turned brittle. The sun's calm is as alarming as any omen. Direction favors glossy surfaces punctured by moments of brutality or revelation. Modern architecture doubles as ritual geometry, suggesting the future can be corrupted long before it arrives. It plays like a cautionary tale about hubris dressed in sensational clothing, the idea that the end could be built with contracts and steel, right on schedule. When the final choices present themselves, they don't look like heroics. They look like damage control in a world already tipped. Shock, Beyond the Door 2, 1977. A young mother tries to start over in a house that remembers more than she does. With a new husband and her son in tow, she's determined to make peace with the past. Until objects shift, doors breathe, and the boy's smile holds something she can't recognize. Grief, guilt, and something supernatural converge in rooms that won't let go. This is possession territory, but filtered through domestic unease, hairbrushes, photographs, a child's whisper at the end of a hallway. The movie keeps its terror close to the body, hands, eyes, a sudden change in posture, suggesting that the haunting might be psychological until it plainly isn't. The pace lets dread accrue, each small anomaly stacking into a pattern you can't unsee. Performances lock onto instability, especially from the lead, whose breakdown feels both intimate and mythic. Direction leans into disorienting edits and tactile sound, turning familiar spaces uncanny. The house is never just a setting. It's a collaborator, a witness, a trap that rearranges itself around the person most vulnerable to it. By the end, moving on has become a cruel joke. The film argues that some houses and some histories don't forgive. It's a tight, unnerving descent where motherhood, memory, and possession overlap until you can't tell where one stops and the next begins. Blue Sunshine, 1977. Blue Sunshine, directed by Jeff Lieberman in 1977, is a paranoid, slow-burning horror thriller that perfectly captures the unsettling anxiety of the late 70s. The story begins with a string of mysterious murders in Los Angeles, each committed by seemingly ordinary people with no apparent motive. As the plot unfolds, it becomes clear that all the killers once ingested a batch of the experimental hallucinogenic drug Blue Sunshine a decade earlier. The effects of the drug don't appear immediately. They fester for years before triggering violent psychosis, leaving the audience with a creeping sense of dread that anyone could be affected at any moment. The film excels at tension and atmosphere. Urban landscapes are shot in muted tones, with empty streets, shadowed alleyways, and flickering lights, emphasizing the isolation and unpredictability of the threat. The cinematography often lingers on mundane moments that suddenly become terrifying, reminding viewers that horror can emerge from the everyday. The narrative is carefully paced, slowly revealing the connections between victims and building a sense of paranoia that permeates every scene. Blue Sunshine isn't just a thriller about random killings. It's a commentary on the fragility of the human mind, the dangers of experimentation, and the anxieties of an era obsessed with drugs and social change. The performances amplify the tension, with ordinary people turning unpredictable in subtle yet shocking ways. By the climax, the film's slow burn explodes into moments of chaos that are both horrifying and mesmerizing, leaving viewers questioning how fragile sanity can be when pushed to the edge. For 70s horror fans, Blue Sunshine remains a standout. It's an unnerving, atmospheric experience, combining psychological dread, social commentary, and the uneasy strangeness that made obscure 70s films so unforgettable. Martin, 1977. He says there's no magic, just needles, razor blades, and a hunger he can't name. In a gray steel town, a quiet young man believes he's a vampire. Or maybe he's just sick and alone. Either way, people keep dying, and he keeps telling himself he's not a monster. Not exactly. The film sticks close to Martin's point of view, building a world of late-night trains, empty kitchens, and bedrooms where fear arrives softly. Black and white reveries cut through the present like faded memories, or fantasies of cloaks and castles that may never have been real. The contrast is the point. The old myths are beautiful, but the truth is clinical, tragic, and human. Performances are delicate, especially from the lead, whose calm voice and stillness make every scene feel like a confession. The direction is intimate and unmannered, letting ordinary spaces carry extraordinary dread. Instead of grand Gothic spectacle, you get hallways, telephones, and the hum of appliances. Its legacy rests in empathy, a horror story that refuses easy answers, neither romanticizing nor demonizing its subject. It's disturbing because it feels possible, a portrait of isolation that lingers long after the credits, asking whether evil is in the blood, the brain, or the world that won't make room for you. The Evil, 1978. Long before real estate horror became a staple of the genre, The Evil gave us a cautionary tale about bargain mansion shopping. When psychologist C.J. Arnold and his wife Caroline stumble upon a sprawling Civil War-era mansion at an unbelievable price, they see the perfect opportunity to convert it into a clinic. But as they and their friends begin renovations, they're about to learn why some properties stay on the market. Led by the always reliable Richard Crenna, this supernatural thriller takes a seemingly simple haunted house setup and cranks up the intensity with some genuinely creative practical effects. The film doesn't just give us creaky doors and cold spots. We're talking full-on supernatural chaos with bodies being tossed around like rag dolls, mysterious fires, and possessions that'll make you think twice about buying that fixer-upper. What sets The Evil apart from other haunted house films of its era is its gradual descent from renovation project to survival horror. Director Gus Triconis, working with a modest budget and just 30 days of shooting time, manages to create an increasingly claustrophobic atmosphere where the house itself becomes a malevolent character. Shot in an abandoned health spa in New Mexico, the location adds an authentic layer of decay and menace that money can't buy. And while the fashion choices might firmly plant this film in the 1970s, the scares and tension hold up surprisingly well. Keep an eye out for a memorable appearance by Victor Buono that takes this haunted house story into unexpected territory. The Evil might have slipped through the cracks over the years, but it's a solid reminder that sometimes the best horror films are the ones that take familiar elements and twist them into something uniquely unsettling. Magic, 1978. Years before Silence of the Lambs, Anthony Hopkins delivered another chilling performance in this psychological thriller, directed by Richard Attenborough. Hopkins plays Corky, a struggling magician who finds success only after adding a ventriloquist act with a dummy named Fats to his routine. But as Corky's star begins to rise, the line between performer and puppet starts to blur in disturbing ways. Written by William Goldman and produced on a $7 million budget that allowed for top-tier talent, Magic takes what could have been a simple killer doll story and transforms it into a sophisticated character study. The film features strong supporting performances from Anne Margaret as Corky's high school sweetheart and Burgess Meredith as his agent. But it's the unsettling dynamic between Hopkins and his wooden co-star that steals the show. What sets Magic apart from other ventriloquist horror films is its focus on psychological deterioration, rather than supernatural elements. Fats, designed by former Disney artists, became one of the most memorable dummies in cinema history. Not because he comes to life, but because of how he represents the fracturing of Corky's psyche. Shot partially at Blue Lakes, California, the film's isolated location adds to its claustrophobic atmosphere. There's a reason this film earned multiple award nominations. It takes familiar elements and crafts them into something uniquely disturbing. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones that come to life. They're the ones we create ourselves. The Toolbox Murders, 1978. Before home renovation shows made tools seem friendly, the Toolbox Murders took everyday hardware and turned them into instruments of terror. Set in a Los Angeles apartment complex, this infamous exploitation film follows a masked killer who turns a simple toolbox into something far more sinister. But what starts as a straightforward slasher takes an unexpected turn into psychological territory that no one saw coming. Shot on a shoestring budget of just $185,000, this film became notorious enough to be banned in several countries. Veteran character actor Cameron Mitchell leads a cast that includes former child star Pamela Ferdin and Land of the Lost's Wesley Ure, bringing unexpected gravitas to what could have been just another exploitation film. What sets Toolbox apart from other slashers of its era is how it shifts gears halfway through. Director Dennis Donnelly takes what seems like a standard stalk-and-slash formula and veers into darker psychological territory, exploring themes of grief and madness. The film's grimy 1970s Los Angeles locations add an layer of urban decay that makes the whole thing feel uncomfortably real. While its initial release might have been overshadowed by bigger horror titles of 1978, the Toolbox Murders has developed a cult following among genre fans who appreciate its ability to balance explicit horror with psychological dread. Long Weekend, 1978. If you're ready for horror that creeps up slowly, scratches at your unease, and takes a dramatic turn when you least expect it, Long Weekend is a late 70s gem that grabs you with its quiet dread. It's Australia's take on ecological horror, a marriage in need of repair, and a wilderness that seems ready to strike back. The story follows Peter and Marcia, a bickering couple driving out of the city in hopes that a camping trip might patch things up. But from the start, their actions rub against the natural world. They litter, destroy, and lash out with thoughtless cruelty, unaware that their surroundings are watching and waiting. The tension doesn't come from traditional jump scares, but from the unnerving sense that every tree, every wave, every animal in the bush has turned against them. The coastal landscapes are shot in ways that make nature feel alive and hostile: sweeping beaches, dark forests, and the eerie presence of a dugong corpse that seems to inch closer each time it appears. The sound design only adds to the unease. Bird calls, rustling branches, and strange cries echo in the distance, transforming the ordinary into something menacing. What makes the film unforgettable is its message. Writer Everett DeRush and director Colin Eggleston crafted a story where the real antagonist is not a masked killer or supernatural force, but the natural world itself. The couple's selfishness and carelessness become their undoing, a sharp reminder that nature has its limits and its own ways of striking back. Long Weekend stands out because of its patience, its bleak mood, and the way it leaves you uneasy long after the final frame. It's not just a horror movie, it's a cautionary tale that feels more timely today than it did when it first hit VHS shelves. The Fury, 1978. Imagine a horror like Carrie crossed with a paranoid spy thriller. That's The Fury, Brian De Palma's 1978 dive into telekinesis, government conspiracies, and mind-bending destruction. It's a film that takes the concept of psychic powers and blows it up to operatic proportions, full of spectacle, paranoia, and explosive violence. The story follows Peter Sansa, played by Kirk Douglas, a former intelligence agent whose teenage son Robin is kidnapped for his psychic gifts. Behind it all is Peter's ex-colleague, a ruthless government operative who wants to weaponize Robin's powers. Determined to get his son back, Peter allies with Jillian, a young woman with her own dangerous abilities, and together they try to outwit the system that's exploiting them. De Palma pulls out all the stops with his trademark visual style. Split screens, slow motion, and dizzying camera tricks crank up the tension, while the film builds toward scenes of shocking telekinetic destruction. And then there's the unforgettable finale, one of the most audacious and explosive endings of any horror thriller from the 70s. A set piece that still shocks with its sheer audacity. The film is elevated further by a haunting John Williams score, weaving between delicate melodies and jarring bursts of dread, giving the psychic powers an emotional weight that makes every outburst feel terrifyingly real. What sets The Fury apart is how it blends genres, equal parts supernatural horror, political thriller, and family tragedy. It's a cautionary tale about power spiraling out of control, about institutions that manipulate and destroy in the name of control, and about the devastating price of weaponizing the human mind. While it never reached the mainstream success of Carrie, The Fury has carved out a place as a cult classic. It's stylish, strange, and unafraid to go completely over the top. A film that delivers psychic horror at its boldest and most spectacular. The Grapes of Death, 1978. Elizabeth is boarding a train bound for a dream wedding, only to discover the countryside's turned into a nightmare. Jean Rollin's slow-burning ecological horror from 1978. It's a film that takes the tranquil French vineyard and flips it into a nightmare of bloody infections and creeping madness. The story follows Elizabeth, a city woman headed to meet her fiancé at his family's vineyard. But the train ride turns creepy fast. a traveler with a grotesque bleeding neckboards, and she witnesses something horrifying that explodes the tension, quickly transforming the film from a pastoral setting into an unsettling descent. Once she escapes, Elizabeth finds herself wandering into empty villages populated by locals suffering from gruesome boils and snarling disease. They stagger, haunted by the infection spreading like wild poison through their flesh. Roland crafts an environment that feels both dreamlike and relentless. Sunlit forests feel ominous, empty farmhouses feel alive with threat, and every rustle or distant cry transforms into something deeply unnerving. The infection. It turns out to come from pesticide-tainted grapes. That innocent vineyard now feels like a chemical trap, a realistic, all-too-timely twist that turns rural French charm into ecological dread. And Roland doesn't stop there. In one chilling sequence, a zombie-like figure cradles its own decapitated head with regret, speaking in silent remorse before crawling away, a grotesque image that lingers. Roland's direction thrives on contrasts. Elegant wide shots of vineyards drenched in sunlight suddenly give way to visceral gore, pus, blood, and pitchfork carnage, all rendered in a style that's as surreal as it is shocking. The pacing unnerves. Tracking shots of empty corridors, isolated homes, and strange figures in windows build dread through atmosphere rather than cheap thrills. As much as it's a horror film, The Grapes of Death is also a cautionary tale. One about human hubris, careless chemical tampering, and the violence that blooms when you poison the land. Someone's Watching Me, 1978. Imagine John Carpenter turning Hitchcockian suspense into a primetime thriller. Stylish, shivery, and surprisingly sharp for television. Someone's Watching Me begins innocently. Lee Michaels moves into a high-rise apartment in Los Angeles, stepping away from all she's known for a fresh start in TV directing. The scenery is sleek, the daylight feels false, and something in the air whispers, "Not everything's as it seems." Soon Lee starts receiving anonymous phone calls, odd gifts, and letters announcing a free vacation. Her apartment doesn't feel private, her new job doesn't feel safe, and each detail, an unlocked door, a flickering light, a strange noise, feels amplified, like the walls themselves are watching. The stalker is closer than she thinks, peering through her windows from across the courtyard with a telescope, singular in his obsession, eerily calm in his stalking. Carpenter leans into look and mood over jump scares, using panning shots of towering buildings and peek-through framing to make the city feel claustrophobic even by day. Lee's world is both glamorous and dangerous. She's pulled between the masculinity of her male co-workers' advances, the fierce friendship of Sophie, and the encouragement of Paul, an appealing outsider who may be the only one to see how deep her peril goes. When the authorities offer little help, Lee refuses to cower. She pushes back against invisibility, tracking the messages, confronting the apartment inspector, refusing to be frightened into silence. And in that tension, the film reveals its strength. A smart, stylish heroine standing up to a faceless predator, her every tense breath framed in Carpenter's precise, bulb-lit shots. Someone's Watching Me may not have the famous name-brand impact of Halloween, but it's a compelling, quietly vicious thriller that thrives in shadows and LED glow. It's the lost Carpenter gem that belongs on your shelf if you love slow-burn paranoia, smart female protagonists, and a stalking story that feels dangerously real. The Redeemer, Son of Satan, 1978. The Redeemer, Son of Satan, kicks off in eerie silence. Then an unexpected choir boy emerges from a lake as if summoned. Suddenly, 6 former classmates receive golden invitations back to their alma mater. Does it feel celebratory? Not for long. Once they arrive, the tone flips. The host is a man in a mask and robes, right out of a religious fever dream, lecturing them in sermons dripping with venom, preaching redemption for sins they haven't even remembered committing. Before they can catch their breath, he's picked them off one by one. Trapped in the corridors, hunted inside their own high school, these alumni become targets of chilling judgment. What sets this film apart is its strange soul. The killer isn't your shadowy slasher in a patterned mask. He's a preacher, and he switches costumes mid-kill. Janitor, inspector, clown. He reappears to deliver homilies before each murder. The film looks and feels like it was shot in a time capsule. A low-budget theater turned horror stage, lit in flickering antiseptic halls, grainy yearbook photos, and distorted hymns echoing through dusty hallways. The visual layers crackle with chaos, molded face masks, a crazy puppet in a school auditorium, and a preacher whose two-thumbed hand fades back into normality after the carnage. It's bizarre, disorienting, and beautifully unhinged. Even with its flaws, ragged pacing, absurd plotting, and cringe-inducing theology, The Redeemer endures because it leans hard into its own bizarre logic. It doesn't try to justify its stranger elements. It revels in them. It's the kind of film you'd discover at the bottom of the VHS rental bin, expect nothing, and end up haunted by its morbid confidence. In the realm of cult horror, The Redeemer, son of Satan, stands out as a ritual disguised as a slasher. It doesn't just kill, it punishes, with twisted faith, theatrical flair, and a disturbing kind of poetic justice that lingers long after the tape ejects. The Shout, 1978. In a quiet, windswept English village, Anthony Fielding, a composer fascinated by the boundaries of sound, and his wife Rachel live a life of serene routine until a stranger arrives, bringing with him a claim so outlandish it chills the soul. Charles Crossley is no ordinary traveler. He professes to wield a terrible ancient power, the ability to kill with a single piercing shout. What begins as polite hospitality quickly spirals into a tense, psychological dance as the couple is drawn into a world where logic and reason are pushed to their limits. The film's atmosphere is unforgettable. The Devon coastline stretches wide and lonely, its rugged cliffs and misty landscapes serving as a perfect backdrop for escalating dread. Inside their home, shadows gather in the corners, and everyday sounds, the hum of a refrigerator, the scratch of a piano key, take on a sinister weight. The score, crafted by Genesis members Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford, pulses with an eerie, otherworldly energy, amplifying the tension in ways that are subtle but unforgettable. Each frame seems to whisper that danger is always just beyond perception, that the mind can be both a sanctuary and a prison. At its core, The Shout is a study of power, control, and the fragility of human consciousness. Crossley's presence forces Anthony and Rachel, and the audience, to confront the terrifying possibility that the unseen can dominate the known, that fear itself can become a weapon. The performances are hypnotic, with Alan Bates's enigmatic menace and John Hurt's restrained terror anchoring the story in a way that feels almost tangible. By the time the story reaches its unsettling conclusion, the film has done more than just scare. It lingers, echoing in the imagination, like the very shout it portrays. The Shout is a masterpiece of psychological horror, a film that uses silence, suggestion, and atmosphere to haunt long after the credits roll. It Lives Again, also known as It's Alive 2, 1978. Imagine the terror of a mutant baby unleashed and then multiplied. It Lives Again picks up the chilling legacy of the original It's Alive, cranking the dread higher with not one, but 3 razor-toothed infants wreaking havoc in unsuspecting neighborhoods. The story unfolds through Frank Davis, the grieving father from the first film, now on a crusade. He teams up with scientists to protect a new generation of mutant babies born across the country from a government that intends to eliminate them at birth. When he meets Jody and Eugene Scott, a young couple expecting their own child, Frank warns them of a growing conspiracy. What follows is frantic, covert delivery in a mobile lab, a daring escape, and a fight to keep their offspring alive. Larry Cohen doesn't hide his high-concept premise. He leans into it with full force. Split-second shots of the baby's claws, the unsettling crawl of tiny bodies, and explosive bursts of violence give the film the feel of a fever dream that's just one tear away from going full horror exploitation. Cohen mingles socio-political ideas, nature versus society, government intrusion, with old-school horror on a shoestring budget. The trio of mutant infants may look like bizarre puppetry mixed with Rick Baker's creature magic, but they're menacing in their primal fury. One memorable scene turns a serene pool into a battleground, with tiny limbs transforming it into a pool of terror. There's a brutal logic to the horror. These babies aren't evil, just driven by instincts no one can control or predict. The heart of the film lies in its uneasy moral maze. Are these babies monsters, or the next step of evolution? Frank believes they're not evil. They're born, not made, and fight to prove it. But when destruction spreads and loyalties fracture, even he starts to question whether protecting them is worth the cost. It's a sequel that doubles down on the shock value, even if it loses some of the quiet pathos of the original. Still, for aficionados of bizarre, cult horror, It Lives Again is a weirdly compelling ride. Half conspiracy thriller, half creature feature, all unapologetically strange. The Driller Killer, 1979. Few horror films capture the raw, filthy energy of late 70s New York, quite like The Driller Killer. Released in 1979, it's part art film, part urban nightmare, and all frustration. It's not just a slasher. It's a portrait of a city and a man coming apart at the seams. The story follows a struggling painter trying to survive in a crumbling apartment, while noise, poverty, and desperation close in around him. His life unravels piece by piece until he finally snaps, wandering through the streets at night with a power drill, turning his rage on anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Director Abel Ferrara, who also plays the lead, filmed it guerrilla style on the streets of Manhattan, giving it a gritty realism that feels more documentary than fiction. You can almost smell the garbage and hear the city's endless hum underneath every scene. It's not stylish or slick. It's raw, chaotic, and completely grounded in the ugliness of the real world. What makes The Driller Killer stand out isn't just the violence. It's the atmosphere. It captures a moment in time when New York felt like it was rotting from the inside out, and Ferrara treats the killer's breakdown like a symptom of the city itself. There's no glamour here, no cool killer persona, just exhaustion and decay. When it hit home video in the early 80s, The Driller Killer became infamous, one of the titles that helped define the video nasty era in the UK. But behind that reputation is something more interesting. A grimy, desperate reflection of urban isolation. It's a movie that gets under your skin not because of what it shows, but because of how real it feels. A slasher that's less about the drill and more about what's driving it. The Traveler, 1979, Spain's The Traveler, also known as El Caminante, or The Devil Incarnate, is one of the strangest and most overlooked films of the 1970s, a dark fable that feels part morality tale, part nightmare, and part road movie through hell itself. Released in 1979 and directed by Paul Naschy, it's a film that takes the shape of an allegory but carries the soul of a grindhouse fever dream. Naschy, best known for his werewolf films, plays the devil in human form, wandering the countryside in the 17th century. He's charming, cunning, and quietly cruel, corrupting every person he meets: beggars, merchants, priests, even the desperate and the innocent. Each encounter becomes a twisted parable about greed, lust, and hypocrisy. But as his journey continues, even the devil starts to feel the weight of what he's created. What makes The Traveler so fascinating is its tone. It shifts constantly between grotesque humor, tragedy, and pure surrealism. There's nudity, blasphemy, and moral decay, but also a strange sense of melancholy running through it all. The rural setting, filled with dust and ruin, gives it the feel of a world already abandoned by God. It's not a film of clean storytelling or traditional horror beats. Instead, it plays like a series of vivid, unholy vignettes, a journey through sin and suffering where every soul is already lost. When it eventually surfaced on home video, The Traveler was embraced by fans of Naschy's darker, more personal work. It's less about monsters and more about humanity at its worst, told through the eyes of the one being who understands it all too well. The Traveler is grim, strange, and completely unlike anything else from the period, a walk through damnation that never feels far from the truth. Prophecy, 1979. Prophecy is what happens when a big studio tries to make an environmental message movie and accidentally creates one of the strangest creature features of the 1970s. Released by Paramount in 1979, it's a mix of serious eco-horror, pulp sci-fi, and unintentional comedy that's somehow become a cult classic. The story follows a doctor and his wife sent to rural Maine to investigate pollution from a paper mill. The toxic runoff is poisoning the land and the local wildlife, but the real horror is what it's doing to the forest itself. Something enormous and horribly mutated is lurking in the woods, a creature born from mercury and revenge. The film tries to balance environmental drama with monster mayhem, but those tones collide in spectacular ways. It's beautifully shot, misty forests, wide rivers, and haunting landscapes. But then the mutant bear shows up, and all sense of restraint goes out the window. The creature design is unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. Lumpy, hairless, and shrieking, like a nightmare someone stitched together from a biology textbook. What saves Prophecy from being just another monster movie is how sincerely it takes itself. It's trying to say something meaningful about pollution, exploitation, and the arrogance of humanity. But it's delivered through a rubber monster that mauls campers in sleeping bags. The result is bizarrely entertaining, a perfect balance of message and madness. When it hit home video, Prophecy found a second life, as one of those you've-got-to-see-this movies. Not because it's great, but because it's too weird to ignore. It's earnest, overblown, and completely unforgettable. Prophecy proves that even when Hollywood aims for serious commentary, sometimes the monster steals the message. And that's what makes it perfect. Beyond the Darkness, 1979. Italy's Beyond the Darkness is one of those horror films that feels like it shouldn't exist. A mix of melodrama, decay, and raw shock value that pushes even the most jaded horror fan to the edge. Released in 1979 and directed by Joe D'Amato, it's both disgusting and oddly beautiful. A film that turns grief into obsession and obsession into rot. The story centers on a man named Frank, who becomes unhinged after the death of his girlfriend. Unable to let her go, he digs up her corpse, preserves it in his home, and tries to carry on life as normal. But as his sanity collapses, his house becomes a tomb, filled with blood, embalming fluid, and madness. D'Amato shoots it all with uncomfortable intimacy, bright lighting, long takes, and close-ups that don't flinch. There's a sense of domestic calm that makes the violence even harder to watch. It's not a movie about monsters. It's about loneliness so deep it rots from the inside out. The score by Goblin gives it a strange elegance, and that clash, beautiful music over horrifying imagery, makes Beyond the Darkness feel more tragic than exploitative. By the time it made its way onto home video, it had already built a reputation as one of the most disturbing Italian horror films of the decade. It's not for everyone, but for those who can handle it, Beyond the Darkness is unforgettable. A grim reflection on grief, death, and what happens when love refuses to die. Savage Weekend, 1979. Savage Weekend is a strange one. A movie that feels like a slasher, a soap opera, and a grim exploitation film all at once. Shot in the mid-70s but released in 1979, it landed right before the slasher boom exploded, making it one of those transitional horror oddities that doesn't quite fit into any box. The story follows a group of friends from the city heading to a rural town for a weekend getaway. But the trip quickly turns sour. Local hostility brews. Secrets come out, and someone starts stalking them from behind a grotesque mask. What begins as a romantic drama turns into something far more violent. What's interesting about Savage Weekend is how disjointed it feels. But that disjointedness works in its favor. It's slow, talky, and filled with tension that never quite pays off in the way you expect. The film spends a surprising amount of time exploring the relationships between the characters, only to twist that intimacy into paranoia and fear. There's a rough, unpolished quality to the whole production that makes it feel genuine, like you're watching something real slowly fall apart. It's shot with a gritty, handheld energy, full of natural light and long silences that make the violence hit even harder when it comes. When it eventually made its way to home video, Savage Weekend found its audience among fans of early slashers and regional horror. People who appreciate the awkward, unpredictable tone that came before the formula set in. It's not slick, it's not consistent, but that's the charm. Savage Weekend feels like a forgotten relic from the moment right before horror figured out what it was going to be. Messy, human, and unnervingly real. Fascination, 1979. Jane Rawlins' Fascination is one of the most striking and dreamlike horror films of the late 70s, a gothic fever dream drenched in elegance, blood, and surreal eroticism. Released in 1979, it perfectly captures Rawlins' signature blend of sensuality and decay, where beauty and death always seem to exist side by side. The story begins with a thief on the run who takes refuge in an isolated chateau, only to discover it's inhabited by two mysterious women. They welcome him in, but their charm hides something sinister. As the night unfolds, the lines between hunter and prey blur, and what starts as seduction quickly turns into something far darker. Like most of Rawlins' work, Fascination moves at its own pace, slow, hypnotic, and full of quiet menace. The chateau itself becomes a character filled with mirrors, long corridors, and a sense that time doesn't quite work the same way inside its walls. The film's imagery is unforgettable. Black capes fluttering across open fields, scythes glinting in the sun, and crimson blood staining marble floors. There's little dialogue and even less logic, but that's part of its power. Rawlins doesn't want you to understand Fascination. He wants you to fall under its spell. It's equal parts art film and horror movie, sensual and sinister in the same breath. When it found new life on home video, Fascination became one of Rawlins' most celebrated works, not for its story, but for how it feels. It's the kind of film that haunts you, not because of what happens, but because of how it lingers. A slow, beautiful nightmare that never quite ends. Don't Go in the House, 1979. Don't Go in the House is one of the darkest and most uncomfortable American horror films to come out of the late 1970s. Released in 1979, it was part of the early wave of psycho killer movies, inspired by Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it pushes even further into the disturbing psychology of isolation and abuse. The film centers on Donnie Kohler, a lonely man who grew up under the control of an abusive mother who burned him as punishment. When she dies, Donnie's mind unravels. He builds a steel-lined room in his house, soundproofed and sealed, where he begins bringing home women to reenact the trauma he can't escape. It's a setup that's both horrifying and strangely sad, the portrait of someone completely hollowed out by childhood pain. What sets Don't Go in the House apart from other late 70s exploitation films is its tone. It's quiet, bleak, and almost clinical in how it observes Donnie's breakdown. There's no joy in the violence, no release, just dread. The sterile lighting and cold industrial spaces make the entire film feel detached, like watching a nightmare from behind glass. When it hit home video, it quickly became notorious for its most graphic scene, one that got it banned or heavily cut in several countries. But even stripped of shock value, it remains deeply unsettling. Don't Go in the House is horror stripped to its bones. No glamour, no charm, just human damage laid bare. It's not a fun watch, but it's one that sticks with you, long after the credits fade. Nightwing, 1979. Nightwing is one of those late 70s studio horror films that tried to mix social commentary with creature thrills, and ended up creating something strangely unique. Released in 1979, it's a blend of ecological horror, Native American mysticism, and small-town paranoia, with killer vampire bats thrown in for good measure. The story is set in a remote desert community in New Mexico, where cattle are dying mysteriously, and the locals are divided between superstition and science. A local tribal deputy begins investigating, uncovering a terrifying truth. A swarm of rabid vampire bats infected by an ancient curse is heading straight for the town. What follows is part monster movie, part spiritual reckoning. Director Arthur Hiller treats the material seriously, almost too seriously, filling the film with sweeping desert landscapes, ritual symbolism, and slow burn tension. But when the bats attack, all that restraint vanishes in a flurry of shrieks, blood, and chaos. It's a strange tonal clash that somehow works, creating a mood that's both grand and grimy at the same time. Unlike most animal attack movies of its era, Nightwing isn't really about the creatures. It's about people trying to hold on to their beliefs in a world that's changing around them. The clash between modernity and tradition runs through every scene, turning a pulp premise into something unexpectedly thoughtful. When it eventually hit home video, Nightwing found an audience among fans of slow-burn horror and eco-thrillers like Prophecy and the Pack. It's moody, uneven, and often overlooked, but it captures a kind of quiet, end-of-the-decade dread that feels very specific to 1979. Nightwing may have been marketed as a monster movie, but beneath the shrieking bats and desert dust is a story about fear, faith, and the uneasy balance between nature and man. Tourist Trap, 1979. Tourist Trap is one of the great underappreciated horror films of the late 1970s. A strange, surreal blend of slasher terror, supernatural horror, and pure nightmare logic. Released in 1979, it feels like a dream you might have rented by accident. Familiar at first, but getting stranger with every scene until you can't quite believe what you're watching. The story follows a group of friends stranded on a lonely stretch of highway after their car breaks down. They stumble upon a rundown roadside attraction, a wax museum filled with eerie mannequins, and meet the friendly but unsettling owner, Mr. Slauson. From there, the film takes a hard turn into madness as the mannequins start to move on their own, and something unseen begins picking off the visitors one by one. Director David Schmoller, in his debut, brings a dreamlike atmosphere that sets Tourist Trap apart from other late 70s slashers. The sound design alone is enough to get under your skin. The creaking mannequins, the warped voices, and the haunting score by Pino Donaggio, who also worked on Carrie and Don't Look Now. Everything feels slightly off, like reality is bending just out of sight. What makes it special is how unpredictable it is. It shifts from creepy to tragic to downright bizarre, all while keeping a strange emotional core. Chuck Connors' performance as Slauson is both sympathetic and terrifying. A lonely man surrounded by his family of lifeless figures, drifting further into delusion. When Tourist Trap hit home video, it became a word-of-mouth favorite, the kind of movie people would stumble across late at night and never forget. It's eerie, imaginative, and way more artistic than its title suggests. Tourist Trap is pure nightmare fuel, a surreal roadside detour into the uncanny, where the mannequins never stop watching, and escape feels like another illusion. The Killer Nun, 1979. The Killer Nun is one of those movies that could only have come out of Italy in the late 70s. A mix of religious guilt, psychological breakdown, and lurid exploitation that somehow manages to feel both shocking and sincere. Released in 1979 and directed by Giulio Berruti, it sits right at the intersection of art house melodrama and grindhouse scandal. The film follows Sister Gertrude, a nun recovering from brain surgery, who begins to spiral into madness. Her faith unravels, her behavior becomes erratic, and soon she's lashing out in increasingly violent and immoral ways. The convent around her turns into a maze of repression and desire, where prayer, addiction, and murder start to blend together. Anita Ekberg gives the film its strange gravity. Her performance walks a tightrope between tragic and unhinged, turning what could have been pure exploitation into something oddly sympathetic. You feel the sickness, the confusion, and the slow moral decay creeping into every scene. Like much of Italy's nunsploitation wave, The Killer Nun uses shock to explore themes the church would rather avoid: hypocrisy, temptation, and the human weakness beneath devotion. The cinematography is clinical and detached, full of sterile corridors and cold light that make the violence feel even more disturbing. It's easy to dismiss a title like The Killer Nun as trash, but there's more going on under the surface. It's about control, guilt, and what happens when the institutions meant to save us are the ones that break us. When it arrived on home video in the 80s, it became infamous, banned in several countries, and lumped in with the video nasties. but over time, it's gained recognition as one of the smarter, moodier entries in the genre. A film that shocks you first, then leaves you thinking afterward. The Killer Nun isn't subtle, but it's unforgettable. A strange collision of faith and madness that could only have been born in 1979 Italy. If you love discovering forgotten horror and cult cinema, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the films time forgot. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.